All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Early Learning Academy. My name is Tony Ioha. It's so nice to see all of your faces today. Before we jump in, I am going to hand it over to Ali Stutzer to give us a rundown and then a how-to on some of the technology for today. Ali, all you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Zoom, I'm going to take you through a quick tech check. So at the bottom left hand of your screen, there is a mute button. You're welcome to unmute when we go into breakouts later. You won't be able to unmute during this session, but if you have any questions or need tech support, there is a chat feature. So in the bottom middle of your screen, you can press the chat button, you can private chat with me, or you can send a question to the entire group. If you feel comfortable to turn your video on, at the bottom left-hand corner, there's a start and stop video button. And then when we go into breakout rooms later, you'll see an invitation and there'll be a blue button on your screen where you can click join breakout. We ask that you join. When you get in there, you'll be able to unmute. And if you need tech support or have questions while you're in those, there is a little ask for help button at the bottom and it will notify me and someone will jump into your breakout and help you at that point.
So if any questions come up, as Ali said, just put it in the chat. You can ask Ali, and when you're in breakout rooms, ask for help. So just a snapshot of the day. Today, we're focused on anti-biased pedagogy and family engagement processes that we'll be reflecting on throughout the day. This morning, we will hear from educators in Yoncalla, Oregon, Erin Helgren and Brian Barry. And then we'll have an amazing keynote lined up from two of the four authors of Don't Look Away, Embracing Anti-Biased Classrooms, Dr. Tanya Durden and Dr. Ioma Aruka. Throughout the day, we'll have opportunities for discussions and reflections after we hear from our peers in the field. This afternoon, there'll be a focus on action, planning, and learning with your respective school teams and cross-team learning to provide an opportunity for feedback and additional reflections. As you can see, we've planned in several breaks throughout the day, but if you need, don't hesitate to get up and use the restroom, do whatever you need to do. So before we jump into the day, I just want to take a moment to frame our work. So as you've now read and heard, we're centered on anti-bias learning and efforts as we prepare for transitions back into the world after COVID, getting back into school buildings, students moving into the next grades, families navigating this context while supporting their student transitions, and so many other circumstances that folks are transitioning from. As we head into this anti-bias work, we felt that it was important to frame these conversations with love and care. When we say love, we mean love as the basis for living and for social change. We are talking about leading with compassion and empathy. Love also allows for patience and understanding in both teaching and learning. Some of the work today may be new to you, it may be uncomfortable, and it will require us to stretch ourselves in ways that can be difficult. At this time, we all need love and care as we prepare to support students, families, and ourselves in the upcoming school year. This past year, we've all dealt with the impacts of twin pandemics. We've dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic and societal racism as it's shown up in this year and in the growing awareness of racial inequities and systemic racism in our institutions and our society. We know from our pre-reading that anti-biased and anti-racist pedagogies are an act of love towards children and humanity that can ultimately yield eternal rewards for children and for society. So on that note, I would love to introduce my colleagues from Yoncalla, Erin Helgren and Brian Barry. Erin Helgren works with the Children's Institute as the Early Works site liaison in Yoncalla. For the last 6 years, Erin has built relationships with families and educators to develop partnerships and opportunities for parents to engage in decision-making processes within the school community and beyond. She continues to share her unique experience and expertise in leveraging the strengths and knowledge of the rural communities she has worked with. Erin has already taught me so much about changing mindsets and practices, as well as transforming home to school connections and partnerships. Brian Berry is also here, and he is the superintendent of Yoncalla School District, as well as the principal of Yoncalla High School. He is a formal special education teacher and has been a champion of early learning and now a champion of equity efforts in the district and the community. We are so excited to have you both here to share your experiences and the story of your ongoing anti-bias work. So before I hand it over to you two to share your story, I was hoping that we could get to know you a little better through a few quick rapid fire questions. Erin, I'd love if you could start. The first question is, fill in the blank. Vulnerability is?
So for me, vulnerability is a superpower.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. Brian, how would you fill in that blank? Vulnerability is?
Oh man, I would say for me, it's the ability to listen to others and be comfortable enough in your own skin to admit if you're wrong.
Thank you so much. I think those are both great ones for us all to think about today as we go into the day. And we have lots of opportunities to be open and vulnerable. All right, so now another one, a little more fun, is give us a concert you'll never forget. Brian, you can start us off this time.
Oh, this one's really easy for me. Okay, and I'm going to date myself. 1982, Aerosmith in East Troy, Wisconsin. My wife and I may have been the only sober straight people there.
Sounds like a party. I love it. Erin, what have you got for us?
So I can't decide between two. I had the opportunity to see John Prine in his last tour, and that was pretty incredible. And then also I had this surreal experience in Oakland about 4 years ago, and I saw Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and that was pretty incredible as well.
Nice. I love that. I love going to Oakland for some concerts too. Okay, so our final one before I hand it off to you two. What is one thing that you are deeply grateful right now? Erin, why don't you start us off?
So right now, this morning, after the end of the school year, I'm deeply grateful that it's summertime, and summer break. But I'm actually really grateful for people's willingness to show up and do the hard work.
Brian, what about you?
Well, I think mine is really similar. I'm grateful that we were able to make it through the school year without any major closures, with, a pandemic and all the fires and just all the disruptions in education throughout the year.
That is so great. Thank you. And I hope everybody can take a moment to just reflect on what you're grateful for this morning. We are also grateful for you being here and to hear from our wonderful guests. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Erin and Brian.
Well, I believe I get to go first. So, and that's a good thing for me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Yoncalla. Yoncalla is a really small town, about 1,100 people. It's about 50 miles south of Eugene, right on I-5, beautiful farming community, timber community, and your typical small, rural, conservative town. And I've been there, even though this is my 5th year of being the superintendent, I've been there for 25 years. So obviously I like the community, I like the people, and we've been able to see a lot of change throughout these 25 years that I've been there. In the last 5 years, we've concentrated on facilities improvement, enrollment, our relationship with our community, and those have all improved. And probably the thing I'm proudest of at this moment is our ability to jump into equity and be open enough to listen and to know that there are certain ways in a small rural community, if you want to have a conversation about equity, that you may have to make some compromises to get the ball rolling and to be able to have an open communication dialogue with people. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Erin.
Thank you, Brian. My name is Erin, and I have the honor and the privilege of working in Yoncalla with Children's Institute. And I really do feel like I have the best job in the whole world, and I get to walk alongside parents and community and teacher and children as they think about how to co-construct a healthy, vibrant community for all children. I kind of view my job at Children's Institute as kind of being that link between policy and practice. And my role has been to build relationships with families, to bring partners in a meaningful way, and to work closely with staff to think about children and families in a different way. When I started the job, I was a self-proclaimed outsider, and that was both an advantage and a hindrance. And so the advantages were that I could really see clearly the dynamics at play, and some of those dynamics were driven by misperceptions of families and at times biased beliefs about families and children. And the hindrance, which actually ended up being an asset, was that I experienced a great deal of mistrust. Like I think in a lot of small rural communities, the outsider sometimes has to prove themselves. And so that meant that I had to really be mindful about building strong, healthy relationships with the community. And that ended up being the cornerstone of the meaningful work that's happened in Yoncalla. And I think that the genesis of the relationship building was when there was a mindset shift regarding parents, and really seeing parents as the experts around what their community needed and what their children needed to thrive. We really rethought what leadership looked like in the districts, in the context of parents and staff. And we kind of made a decision that anybody that showed up at the table was identified as a leader. We decided that decisions would be made with parents present, and any barriers to participation would be systematically addressed. And so that included ensuring parents had things like fuel vouchers and childcare and meals and ride sharing. We began funding a parent leadership group that became decisions makers within the district. And we also handed over the data that we collected from parents, and we considered the data theirs, and we worked with the parents and the community to co-create how we would share that out in the community and how we would make decisions based on their data. I think that another turning point for Yoncalla was high quality preschool. And in the beginnings of our preschool experiences are implementing preschool, we really had to do a lot of unpacking to understand the initial resistance to preschool. We needed to understand with loving eyes, historic relationships, and the fear and barriers for all families to access. And we began that by having a conversation. And those conversations still guide us today in our preschool implementation. Early on, conversations with parents, it became clear that providing preschool for a subset of parents that qualified for preschool promise would be divisive. And so we prioritized funding 10% of the families that didn't qualify for preschool promise funding, initially through grants and donation, but led by the district. Brian made a decision that funding would come from the school district budget. Preschool has brought together families that may or may not have come together otherwise. Parents are united in creating a better future for Yoncalla for all students. And Brian, maybe you can share a little bit about where we are now as far as preschool.
I can do that. Okay, so just a little background. You know, when we started this, well, when I jumped in 5 years ago, I remember the classes down at the preschool. They had about 8 to 10 children in them, and now we're at 36, and we have a cap on that. We have 2 rooms as opposed to 1. We have a 5-star rated preschool, you know, and a lot of this is due just to our partnerships with like Children's Institute, Ford Family Foundation, Portland State University. They've really helped. They've helped me grow as a person as far as the early learning movement. So it's been really nice to see that. We've also collaborated with our local Douglas ESD as far as early childhood special education. So we have a room set aside for North County students who are identified in special education to come in. And now our big push next is to work with them and partner with them so that we start an inclusive model. I know Aaron and I both believe that special education students should be in with regular education students. So we're working hard to try to promote that through that partnership. We've also seen the district change a lot in that governance committee that Aaron was talking about. We just finished it. It started at the preschool. It's trickled all the way up to the high school. So we had site council meetings with our Yoncalla Engaged Parents group. They've taken a look at our handbook, given suggestions. And the great thing is I'm learning to listen as a leader, which is very important. And that's what we've done. We've listened, and in the areas that we can change some things and make parents part of this process, we want to do that. And then the big deal for me is the anti-bias approach that we took to our equity push. In Yoncalla, being in a small rural community, we don't have a lot of diversity as far as color goes. However, what I did is I took a look at the proclamation that we put together and that other schools were doing. I looked online and I looked at their proclamations for equality and anti-bias proclamations. And what we were finding is that no small rural schools were doing them. And so what I did is I looked at the larger schools and I found that they were focusing on the race issue, which for me is an important issue. However, I did know that knowing my community, if I focused on that, I wouldn't be able to have much of a conversation and we'd be taking 2 steps backwards. So what we did is we focused on marginalized groups like poverty. And then with the idea that if we can get in the door that way, then we can start down the road looking at data, and then we can start breaking down gender issues, racial issues, things like that. And it's worked really well for us. And also one of the best things I did was I stepped back from this because I'm just an old white guy and I needed somebody else that the board trusted, and that would be Aaron. And Aaron came in and presented to the board, and really the board's asking for more training. We're having great conversations moving forward instead of everybody shutting down and not having the conversations, because to be quite honest, the people in my community don't want to hear what's going on in the big cities. They think that is something that they don't have any business being a part of. So, Aaron, did you have anything to add?
I think you did a great job. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to end it with one thing, because Aaron always says this to me whenever we're having really good days. She never says it when I'm having a bad day, but she'll come up with this smile and go, okay, just so you know, Yoncalla, we're kind of a big deal. So hope everybody has a great conference, and yes, we are a big deal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian and Aaron. I love the close. You are a big deal. That is why we are so excited to learn from you today. I always feel my perspective is kind of opened a little bit more from hearing from y'all. So thank you. Your story also and your efforts remind us the importance of taking time to build relationships, redefine leadership, make tangible investments into the families and communities we serve, actually listen to those families and communities, and then to be responsive to people's needs in both learning and unlearning. So now we are going to transition into part one of our keynote discussion today. And I have the honor of introducing Dr. Ioma Aruka and Dr. Tanya Durden. Dr. Aruka is a research professor in the Department of Public Policy, a fellow at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, and founding director of the Equity Research Action Coalition at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, also known as the Coalition, at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Through the coalition, Dr. Aruka is leading projects and initiatives focused on how evidence-informed policies, systems, and practices in the early years can support the optimal development and experiences of minoritized children and children from low-income households and communities. Her work focuses on ensuring that children start off well, such as through family engagement and support, quality rating and improvement systems, and early care and education systems and programs. Dr. Aruka focuses on ensuring excellence for young, diverse learners, especially Black children and their families, through the intersection of anti-bias, anti-racist, culturally grounded research, program, and policy. Dr. Aruka serves and has served on numerous national and local boards and committees, including the Brady Education Foundation, Trust for Learning, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committees, and the American Psychological Association of Board of Educational Affairs, and the Nation Advisory Committee for the U.S. Census Bureau. Whew, impressive. And then we've got Dr. Tanya Durden, who is a clinical associate professor and birth through 5 program coordinator within the Department of Early Childhood and Elementary Education at Georgia State University. Dr. Durden's primary scholarship and research trajectory focuses on exploring how to develop and support African-American children's socio-cultural identities and creating racially equitable learning experiences for children of color. As a teacher, educator, and researcher, the focus of her work includes also preparing pre-service and in-service teachers to become culturally competent master teachers. Furthermore, Dr. Durden's professional work and scholarship can be categorized into 3 core areas of focus: early childhood education through curriculum and program development, racial educational equity through research to professional practice, and early childhood systems engagement through strategic partnerships and equitable systems building. Dr. Durden is committed to using teacher education and research as an informative vehicle towards helping to develop educators and leaders who become culturally responsive change agents and advocates in their classrooms and their communities. Hello to you both, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
We're so thrilled to be here. And that was a mouthful, so we appreciate all that.
Thank you. You definitely got my vocal warm-up going for the day, and practicing that was also a wonderful vocal warm-up for me. So before we dive into your presentation, and we've gotten incredible opportunity to already hear a little bit about your work experience and your contributions, I was hoping I could also ask you each 3 rapid fire questions so that we could get to know you a little bit better.
Sure.
Go ahead.
All right, we'll start with a fun one. Dr. Durden, give us a film that you really love.
Oh my goodness, I absolutely love it. It's a film / video documentary. And so I love Black is King by Beyonce. It is extraordinary. And my kids, I have a 1, 3, and 5-year-old, and they're mesmerized by it as well. So I love the imagery. I love, of course, the songs, the music, the positive, images of Black and brown individuals. I just grew to it. In my other life, I really am. I look like, I dress like, I have a body like Beyonce. So that's what I look like in my mind, even though that's not the case. So it just allows me to just transport to another space and place. So that is definitely what I enjoy. And I burn some calories too.
That is definitely my pump up video as well to go to. And I love that. Dr. Aruka, what would you say?
Which I mean, I always want to be Beyonce too, but I won't name that one. But I will say one of my favorite, I do love history, is One Night in Miami. And it is the movie that included, Cassius Clay, included Muhammad Ali. And it was just, I mean, it was basically a play. And it just, I think just gave a body to sort of the Black experience, particularly from a Black male's perspective. And so I for one, just love those kind of movies that just give me more history and just give me motivation to continue fighting for justice and fairness. So that's mine.
Yes, that's a good movie.
Oh, that's a good one for me to add to my list. I haven't seen it yet, so got some watching for this week. All right, so our second question is, give us a snapshot of an ordinary moment in your life that brings you great joy.
Oh, shoot,
and
that's
Dr.
an easy
Aruka,
one.
you can start us.
Okay, well, good. That's an easy one. I feel like the one thing is when my son, in particular, I have a 4-year-old son and that 8-year-old daughter. But when my son basically sneaks up on me during the Zoom call and just gives me a hug, right from the behind, like it's so. That's for me. It's like, thank you for reducing my stress.
Oh, I love that. I hope we get to see him today.
No, I don't.
Dr. Jordan, what about you?
Oh my goodness. I would say an ordinary day that brings me so much joy. I would also have to say my family as well. When we just have those ordinary moments where everyone we're in, we have this big sitting room. And in this big, in the sitting room, when no one's pooping, no one's crying, no one's having a tantrum, no one's hitting one another, no one's hungry, but everybody is kind of in their own little space. We're close together, but I'm reading on my Kindle. Husband is zoned out looking at the television. The little ones are playing with their toys and engaging, but we're all there together in that shared, loving, wonderful space. So that's kind of ordinary moments that I absolutely just cherish. And it makes me take a deep breath and say, this is why we work hard. This is why we fight for equity, for this space and this opportunity to just be in the present and in the moment. So that brings me joy, lots of joy.
Oh, thank you both so much for those just examples of mindfulness and just appreciating what we've got around us, right? So our final question, and I think this is a really good one to get us ready for the day, all of us. So, everybody take a moment to think of this one yourselves as well, right? So you're called to do something brave, but your fear is real and it's stuck in your throat. What's the first thing you're going to do? Dr. Jordan, I'll let you start on this one.
So we teach who we are, we lead who we are, we preach who we are, we engage who we are. So the very core of who we are transcends to whatever professional or personal experience or duty that we're called to do. And so who I am is a Black woman focused on equity. And also the core of that is my spirituality. And so the first thing that I do is I pray, because my spirituality is the absolute core of my being and how I present myself to the world. And I also cherish the understanding that I am because we are because I am. And with that, I also believe in a higher power, that I also stand upon the ancestors and also my higher being. And so I can't move unless I follow what the spirit tells me to do, especially in cases where I'm asked to be courageous and where I'm asked to be brave, because I know whether it's the tongue that I use and my voice, my power, my privilege, I can't use that to the greatest extent unless I am operating in the spirit and operating in my purpose. So that's the very first thing that I do, is I just pause and I call upon the ancestors, call upon the spirit, and then move forward, because I can't, it'll be really detrimental to any progress that we have for me to immediately react. And that's a lesson that I've had to learn along the way.
Yes, that was, you don't even got to ask me the same, but in many ways, even though Tanya and I are not in the same room, in some ways we have some shared spirit. And so for me, because I feel like oftentimes the work that I do calls me to sort of be in uncomfortable spaces, even virtually, it's still uncomfortable to talk about issues, I think, of fairness and justice, and especially racism, especially against, oppressed people. So that elevates my blood pressure, and it sort of puts me in spaces where I may not be as fully comfortable, even if I talk about it and write about it every single day. So what I tend to also do is actually, you can't see my wall, but behind my wall is actually an artifact from South Africa. And it was really one of those sort of imagery that just reminds you like of the sun, of the land, of the people, and the journey that you're always on to, because part of being sort of somebody from the diaspora is that you're always on a journey. You're always on a journey to discover yourself, your history, and your roots and your heritage. And so for me, I often turn around and look at that image just to kind of calm me down. And then the second thing that I do, that I know I would do, is I will grab my scarf. You all don't see it, but I have a scarf here that actually, it has an image of sort of Black skin, it's red, it's green. So it really signifies sort of the land, the earth, the people, the sun. And so for me, I often use that as my warm space. So I think if I'm in a moment of fear or anxiety, I actually either look behind me and or just touch my scarf. I know it seems so simple, but it really does bring me to it does connect me to my people and to my elders and to those who are I think, surrounding me in many ways.
Wow, thank you so much for just those like powerful answers. And I feel like you just remind us that we need to find ways to connect to ourselves and to empower ourselves, right? Based on what feels really good. So thank you so much. And with that, I am going to hand it over to you each to give us another opportunity for learning and to hear more from you.
Well, thank you. We're so pleased to be here. And Tony, you're doing an amazing job just being a wonderful moderator. So just thank you. And obviously thank to Erin, Ashley, and all of the Tuna Institute Early Learning Academy for having us. And again, Ioma Ruka here and from UNC Chapel Hill. And I will have my dear colleague, friend, and colleague, Tanya, also say a warm welcome before I share my slides.
Hi, again, Tanya Durden, so excited to be here. And I want to give a little kind of warning. So Iyama and I are sister girlfriends. And so this is the work that we do. We're really excited about this work. And so we're going to be sharing a lot of information with you, but we're also going to have a conversation. So feel free as we are engaging in this, information that we're going to be providing to really use the chat as a mechanism and opportunity to engage with us and to also inquire about what you're learning.
Awesome. So with that, here's our slides. And knowing that in the end of it, we are not, we don't have to do everything in our slides. We are not fully, for most of us, we really do go with sort of what is motivating us. So if there are things that you're like, oh, hold up, Ioma, hold up, Tanya, we got to do something real quick, know that we can pause and really attend to that, as Tanya just said. But before we really get started, we would like to know how you're feeling today. We really want to know, right? It's obviously for here, we're in the East Coast, so Tanya and I are here in the East Coast, and it is 12:06 Eastern Standard Time. Y'all are over there in the morning. You all are still probably stretching, getting your, Eggos and omelets and all that stuff together. But how are you feeling at this moment? And so this will require you to either get your phone, you're already on your computer probably or something. So just go on your computer, your iPad, or if you have your cell phone, which is easier, text this number. So this is the number you're going to text to, 22333. So 22333. Once you text that, you're going to, in the subject of that text is you're going to be Ioma Ruka. I know that's, so make sure you spell it right. Don't transpose the E and the O. So IHEOMAIRUKA 437. It's also on the screen. I'm going to try to make sure that my thing is working right. So basically they still got it. Somebody was fast. Who was that? I want to know who was that. Somebody was fast as hell. Go ahead. So for those, again, 22333, and then in the body will be Ioma Ruka 437. I don't think capitalization matters. And then basically answer the question, how are you feeling today? Are you a 1, not so well, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Like you're like, I am doing it today at 9:06 Pacific Standard Time. Where are you and how are you feeling? So we have, that's great, a majority of you right now. I hope you can see the screen. I hope you can see the polls popping in there. That a majority of you feeling great. Ooh, and it's inching. So I'll give about 25 more seconds. I know, random number here. So you can go ahead and tell us how you're feeling. Oh, we have 17% are like, I am doing it this morning. And I hope it stays that way. Well, for those who are in the ones and the twos, you know, sending you, for whatever reason, sending you as much positive vibe and spirit and thoughts that it gets better for whatever reason. Hold on, is this my thing or is this my, okay, you guys don't see my screen. Okay. Okay, I just wanna make sure you can see it. Okay, something got removed from my thing. I don't know what happened there. Can you still hear me okay? Okay, all right, yeah, so that means I can't see the poll anymore. So it looks like somebody is I'm gonna stop sharing real quickly and then I'm gonna start sharing again. So basically what we did see is that a majority of people were feeling a 3 to 4 and 5. I'll start sharing in a second. There we go. Okay. Okay. So I think somebody might have just came in and just did a few things here. Okay. So you can't see it anymore for some reason, something happened there, but basically what the results suggest that many people were feeling great and some people, oh, here we go. So some people were not feeling as great. So we do send you the most positive of vibes. So to get us moving, again, I want to thank you for the invitation. We are so honored and pleased to be with you. And of course, in normal, whatever that means, normal times, we would have been in person and being able to enjoy all that Oregon has to offer. So again, we just thank you for allowing us to be a space. And before we really kick it off, we wanted to make sure that we honor the native lands. And particularly want to acknowledge that we live, work, and build a lot of our family's economic wealth. And for me, I live in North Carolina, in central North Carolina, by Chapel Hill, Durham, Raleigh, and that's part of the Lumbee tribe land that was taken through colonization and attempted eradication of white settlers. So I say, obviously, I think Oregon, you guys have a relatively high number of tribal communities. So again, we want to always take time to sort of thank the lands that we really are living on and loving on, and make sure that we extend that gratitude for those who continue to protect it and protect us while we build our health and our wealth on it. And then at the same time, I also want to honor Black bodies. I am particularly here in North Carolina, in Chapel Hill. Unless you've been under a rock, you may know that we have some controversies here happening at UNC Chapel Hill, but nevertheless, you know, many beyond, you know, Chapel Hill, North Carolina at large, many parts of the US was built by enslaved Africans and their enslaved descendants. And only really within the past generation, really me and Tanya's generation, where Black people afforded full rights as humans. And so really we know today Black individuals and other people of color and other oppressed groups disproportionately still work as service staff across the country. And really, they're responsible for maintaining the daily lives, the food services, grocery stores, and childcare and early care education, and healthcare, and just many of the basic necessities that make our lives easy. So we want to thank the Black bodies, but also we know that other groups, particularly in the West, have also been oppressed. We want to make sure that we honor them and continue to honor them and recognize the history that we stand on. And then finally, I want to remind us, right? So Tanya and I are going to, you know, go back and forth. And really, as she said, really, we want it to be as much of a conversation as we can. So please use the chat box. And so I think when Tanya or even Tony, if you guys see anything that needs to be flagged, just pause and let us know. But you know, we want to sort of remember those who have been fighting for justices, right? We stand on all those shoulders. And you know, this one in particular sort of makes us think about what it is that we're fighting for, right? We're in a moment in our country where there's a lot, we can go one way or the other. And so I'll just read this from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King that says the following: the ultimate measure of a man, well, I put woman, is not where he or she stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he or she stands in times of challenge and controversy. So again, I sort of implore all of us, no matter what your status, what your role is, where you work, where you live, that we all have a place to stand during times of challenge and controversy, that being in that kind of space is not easy, but we are called upon to do that as much as we can. So I sort of, again, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King died at a very early age, and to just imagine all that he did, you know, before his death is amazing. So let's all remember that a lot of people have fought for us to be here, and so thank you for allowing us to be here.
now I'm going to take over and I'm going to provide just a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing. So in the chat box, if you can take a look at our agenda and what is it here on our agenda that you're really excited to learn about. So go ahead in the chat box now and identify which one of these agenda items that you're really excited about. I know what I'm excited about. Yama, what are you excited about on this list?
Oh, well, talking about children and families.
Yes, family engagement. All right, Ann. All right, I'm excited about 16. Yes, that's what I'm talking about, Angela. What else are we excited about? Yes, what are we excited about? Well, I'm excited that you're excited because we're going to definitely get this party started. Someone also put letters, engagement around systemic barriers. And so we wanted to also begin with this slide because unless you speak Arabic, you may not know what this slide says. And we want you to, throughout our talk today, to really begin to see through the cultural lens of children, of colleagues, who are from ethnically and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And that's very important because, again, I mentioned earlier when we were having the rapid fire that we blank who we are. So we teach who we are, we learn who we are, we experience who we are. And oftentimes as educational leaders, as policymakers, as district leaders, as teachers, as instructional coaches, whatever capacity that you're working in education, we often prioritize our own cultural lens and our own cultural ways of being. And just imagine, if you were, as you are, attending this professional development, some of you were very creative and innovative and say, what I'm interested in number 16, or I'm interested in family engagement. This has nothing about family engagement. But you have this, the spirit of, well, I'm going to work with what I have. But just also imagine if this was your daily experience every day, that my cultural lens, what I'm learning about, what I'm engaging in, the language that's being spoken is totally outside of the framework of who I am. So I'm not able to bring in my cultural knowledge. I'm not able to bring in my language. I'm not able to bring in the skills and the contributions that I can make in the classroom because I don't see myself, I don't feel myself, I don't experience myself. So this is a psychological, this is a cultural, this is a linguistic, this is the academic, this is the social, the emotional, the cognitive experience that many Black and Brown children experience in our classrooms each day. And so we wanted to start off with this visual so that you can get just a small taste of what it is like to experience otherness. And we want to continue to push you and challenge you to think about that. You can go on, Yelma. So this is our actual agenda. So we're going to look at kind of this element of identity. So looking at systemic barriers to anti-bias and anti-racism education. And we're really going to focus in very specifically on that this first hour. And then you're actually going to have an opportunity to debrief and really talk about some of the information that we've shared. And then we're going to explore very specific approaches to culturally relevant and equitable focused education. And then we're going to examine what this actually looks like, not only the instructional piece, but also how to engage with families. And so next I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Iruka, we have to start off with a little basic facts and truths. So I'm going to hand it off to her.
Yeah, it is really, everybody's like, this is normal. So I'm going to breeze right through it because this is really, as early childhood, obviously professionals, this is kind of just what we all know, right? The fact that early experiences are essential and they build the brain. Like that is something that we now know. We know that those things matter. Not only do they build the brain, but they also have part in health development and other things. We also know that early adversities can change the timing of critical periods of brain development. We know about plasticity of development, but we know adversities can impact that. And we know that this begins early prior to birth. So it actually begins in the preconception period. So it starts prenatally. And of course, we know this is why early childhood exists, because we know that supportive relationships between children and adults in life are essential, and they're essential to buffer against negative factors, but also adversities writ large. And then just a couple of things that we all agree to, I think, is that really that in the end of it, the access to basic resources, prenatally and throughout the life course really matter, and they are powerful. So think about the global pandemic. When you don't know where your next food is coming from, when you don't know what house where you're going to live, that has an impact on just your normal way of thinking. So think about, we have the term called, hangry. When you are hungry, you have a psychological reaction that you become short-tempered, stressed. So imagine a child or an adult who literally does not know when their next food will come. That has an impact on them. And then finally, I think, obviously, clear due to the racial reckoning, we now do recognize that both institutional racism and interpersonal experiences of discrimination can influence the health and well-being of both children and adults. So this last part is one that we have finally, I think, put into the science books, that we can no longer disregard the impact of racism and systemic inequities, whether it's economic inequities and other kind of oppressive sort of factors, that those things actually matter for not just adults' development, but children's development. And there's just a couple of things, right? That we know that the reason why we're all together is that we all agree that early child experiences matter, because they set the stage for children's later life outcomes. So if children are experiencing economic hardships or housing insecurity, it actually has these negative impact in terms of their positive development over time. However, if they experience more of the high social status, economic status, positive and affirming parenting, we know that also, serves as a promotive factor across the life course. So we know that different points in time where certain things matter. But we know in early childhood, because it is a foundation for children's language, their cognitive skills, their regulation, and all of the health functioning, that because that is the first time, that's the first period that's sensitive to all of those things, that we know that what matters, which is the basic resources, enriching learner experiences, promoting and protecting children from harm and trauma, that is what we need to make sure that happens in the early years of life. And then, of course, we're not in Oregon necessarily, but we are in Oregon. And, as somebody who has been doing some work with the state of Oregon for a little bit, right? As we think about early childhood, right, we think of it as a strategy to mitigate against inequities, particularly poverty in particular. And so we all need to wonder, right? Oregon, you're becoming a more diverse state. And if you look at this figure here, while you're still a majority white state, there is, by 2060, probably by 2050, you're going to actually begin to see a reduction in the number of white people and increase in the people of color. However, there's no sign that the Black population is going to increase, and we won't talk about that exactly. But this is something to think about. Does diversity, is that an opportunity to continue to create equitable systems? And in particular, hearing both Brian and Aaron talk about, is it Yonkali? How do you pronounce it, Brian? How do you pronounce it? Go ahead and unmute, and so I can make sure I pronounce it right.
It's Yonkala. We're kind of a big deal.
See, Yonkala, there you go. Thank you, Brian. Right, so Yonkala, right? I think even though you don't have sort of the racial diversity, the economic diversity matters. And so is that an opportunity to create equitable systems? And so when I personally, from the East Coast, think about Oregon, I really think of it first from the historical lens of, it was the only state to actually enter the union as a white-only state. But it's also now the state where a lot of things around Black Lives Matter, a lot of racial injustice protests actually happen. So it's almost this dichotomy of what is Oregon? And so I think just being able to hear Brian and Aaron talk about Yonkala really speaks to sort of that shifting that's happening. And just even us being together, even virtually, to talk about anti-bias and obviously eventually anti-racism, right? It's almost an opportunity to begin to say, how do we create an equitable, fair, and just society? And to me, Oregon is really one of those spaces where there's a lot of innovation happening, but also there's a historical lens from Oregon in that you were the only state to enter the union as a white-only state. So Tanya, do you want to take and give us some more richness?
Absolutely. And so a part of it is we're thinking about what Eoma just shared about, in order to move forward in addressing some of the systemic issues that we all face, in our different educational systems that we have, we really have to look at history, and we have to look at what is the history of racism, the history of biases in our educational system. And so these are just a couple of questions we want you to begin to think about. And we also want you to encourage you to answer, if you already know, at least some of the answers to these in the chat box. So the first is, what is the history of education and access in Oregon? So think about, the power, the privilege, the policies that are in your school systems, as well as your early learning programs. What is the history of access to the workforce and leadership? So what we do know is in early childhood is a little bit more diversity than K through 12, just a little bit. So we have on average about 30% of our workforce that are Black and Brown individuals in early childhood. But when we get to K to 12, it goes dramatically to about 12%. So we have anywhere between 84 to almost 90% of our K to 12 workforce that are predominantly middle-class white female teachers. And so what you have to look at in Oregon is, well, let's look at who actually has access to workforce and to leadership and to who are actually teaching young children. One of the things that's important for us also consider when we think about history is we think about the impact of integration, and particularly the impact that it's had on the workforce, particularly African-American teachers. And so when integration happened in the 60s and 70s, that completely, in many cases, dismantled the Black workforce, where they were distributed to either they were, their schools were shut down, which were in predominantly African-American communities, or they were relegated to assistant positions or non-teaching positions. So really think about in Oregon, what is your history as it relates to Black and Brown teachers? Why are we having this conversation? Why is that important? What we know is that we have empirical research and data that says that teachers of color bring different perspectives. They bring also a cultural relevancy to Black and Brown children, and also to white children as well. And so it's very important for us to have a workforce that represents the diversity in our community, in our schools, as well as our country. And so begin to kind of think about what's the history. Also think about the history of beliefs and practices as it relates to family and community engagement. Do we have a top-down version? And Ioma's going to talk about a lot about this actually in the next session about, well, what do we mean when we talk about engaging families? Again, what is your policy? If you're at the program level, what is your program policy? You know, we have this rhetoric about, oh, we have this open door policy about families, but we really don't have an open door policy. We have a policy of, this is how we're going to do things, and this is the way we need you to support us in doing these things. And it's not a partnership. We're not working with families. We are talking at families, and we're not really truly engaging them in the learning experiences of their child. Also, what is the current state of education, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the data, because that's very important to look at the data. What does the data say? Not how we feel and how we think things are going, but what does the data tell us about how we're truly creating equitable or not equitable spaces in classrooms? And then what is the state and the local stance on anti-racism and anti-bias education? All right, this is a very critical question, because what I'm hearing in the news, what I'm hearing, and not even what I'm hearing in the media, but what I'm actually seeing here in Georgia, are policies very explicitly saying you cannot implement, teach about anything related to critical race theory, anything that's going to alienate children based on their race, anything that's going to even pivot or talk about Georgia as being racist or having racism. That within itself is racist. To say I can't talk about my lived experiences is a form of racism. It is a form of systemic racism. It is a form of oppression to oppress a whole body of people and their experiences. And so I want you to really think about what is the current stance on having children to really, children and families, to express what they're experiencing today. I'm not talking about in the 1800s, in the 1700s, and even in Jim Crow and in the 50s. I'm talking about right now. So these are experiences of racism that young children, their families are experiencing right now. And so in order for us to really do this anti-racism and anti-bias work, really think about what are the educational policies that are being pushed through in your state and at your local level that's going to make this journey very difficult, because there's many cases, at least here in Atlanta, that says you cannot talk about these things. And also, what are you willing to do? So throughout our talk, we're going to talk about this. What are you willing to do? Because we each are giants, and we each have power and privilege that we can use to advance this efforts. Take it away, Ioma.
Ye- Yes. So what are you willing to do? I think that is the question. But before you think through that, I think it's also important for you to understand, are you providing the equitable access, experiences and outcomes that you want, right? Again, when we go back to the science about the importance of early childhood, are we providing all of that? Are we making it accessible, whether by race, income, gender, et cetera? What are the actual experiences? And are the outcomes also equal, or do we have issues there? And so I think exactly to Tanya's point, we have to go back and really uncover what I would say are the histories of the practices, the histories of access, the history of the workforce. Like these things actually matter because they create the condition to get what you want out of, I would say, early care education and other educational and human services, right? In our national data, we often see that children of color, so this is data from the National Center for Education Statistics, Department of Education, that just often just shows, you don't have to look at the number, I can just tell you what it says, right? Basically is that, children of color, Black children in particular, whether you're in center-based programming or home-based programming, are likely to be in low to moderate quality care. But really, in reality, the problem is that a lot of children, regardless of race, are likely to be in low to moderate quality care. That is a larger issue, but we know when we break it down further by race and ethnicity, we do see, so particularly Black children are likely to be in low to moderate quality care. Whether you're in public programs or even in Head Start programs that are regulated with at least 800 different standards, there's still a pattern that even in our federally regulated programs, we do still have this distribution in terms of quality that Black children are likely to experience, but also quality that Latino children are likely to experience. But again, it's a reminder that many children are, no matter what your race, are still experiencing lower quality care than what we think they should have. And again, when we think about even the standards we use, whether we're using the environment rating scales, whether we're using the classroom assessment scoring system, or whatever other standards we're using, whether it's teacher, workforce, or other things, we still find low quality care structurally, but also in the interactions that we're having. We know data from Walter Gilliam, for example, really shows that no matter what teachers, again, regardless almost of their race and actual ethnicity, are primed to look at Black children in particular as always going to be engaged in oppositional behavior. So they are primed to almost interrupt and say, hey, you're about to do something. So those are biased, sort of racialized trauma that Black children in particular likely to experience. Again, not because of their actual behavior, but because of their perceived behavior or behaviors that teachers anticipate is going to happen. And on top of that, we do have incidences of young children being, the police being called on them for, throwing tantrums. Again, yes, I'm not disregarding the experiences of potential fear or concerns that teachers may have for young children, but we're talking about 60-month-olds. We're talking about, in some instances, 50-month-olds who police is being called on because they are engaging in many instances what I would say are development appropriate practices, which is basically kids are going to be kids in many ways. They don't have the full language to articulate all that they're feeling. Imagine us as adults who have been, for most of us, if we've been fortunate, have been in our home or somewhere, where we couldn't be in our normal spaces of whether it's worship or with friends or going to restaurants. If you've been sort of quote unquote trapped, there's a level of anxiety because you have no control, you have no power to make decisions. So imagine a child who literally feels like I have nowhere to go, I can't move, I can't think, because you're always going to see me as this sort of this person who's disturbing your class, and then to call a police or somebody who looks like the police on them is a form of trauma that we are actually instituting in our programs and in our classrooms. And so these are just images that we have, and we have many others that literally are not even taped, but we all have, for those of us who've been in many programs, have seen, right, a lot of microaggressions that are happening. So we have to begin to think about what are the harms that our children are experiencing. And with COVID-19, we saw the disproportionate effect on Black and Brown children and children whose families were living in low wealth circumstances, who were essential workforce. So again, we have all these imagery and all this data and science that tells us that we have to not just think about what's happening in the classroom, but also what's happening out in society that literally places certain groups of children at risk because of their race, of their culture, or their economic background. And then to just talk briefly about outcomes from the national end, because time would actually take and talk a little bit more about Oregon specific, but I want to make sure that we take some caution in not thinking that early care education in of itself is going to address all of society's ills. no matter, I mean, I was at, I'm right now UNC Chapel Hill. I'm, at FPG in particular, I'm a fellow there. It is known for the Abecedarian study, one of the seminal studies for early care education. I was also a chief research officer at high school, known for the preschool study, right? So these studies are often used to say that, you get a 7 to 10% return of investments in early childhood. Those are important seminal studies. However, they are not going to address all of the inequities that exist from 1619 to 2021, right? So we have to put early childhood as a strategy for addressing inequities, but it's not the only strategy, and it's not a silver bullet. But this particular data, what it tells us in particular, is that if we look at outcomes for children right before they go into, right when they enter, school. So I'll orient you. The first set of slides is around reading, and the second is around math. And it's color coded to say fall of kindergarten, which is basically when children finish up with their preschool or pre-K, they enter into kindergarten. And so what this data is telling you that Black and Latino children are, in comparison to white children, are likely to be lower in reading and also in math. And if you look at the sort of the data, the light blue, the dark blue, and the sort of that reddish is kind of over time. So that's in fall of kindergarten, spring of kindergarten, and then spring of first grade. So that tells you over time that Black children and Latino children in particular have continual sort of gaps continue between Black children and white children. We don't have the same pattern for Asian children. And then of course the other, for those who are natives or from tribal communities, I'm sorry, you are on the other. So this is part of the challenge of national data, in that they tend to lump Native and other mixed race into the other category. But it does say that for the most part, children of color tend to, in comparison to white children, seem to sort of, the gaps actually exacerbate over time. But of course, if we actually compare it to Asian, it's actually even worse. So that's what we actually don't do, is compare it to the Asian group. Again, I want to also make sure that I made this note that there are heterogeneity within groups, right? Even within the Asian group, we know that there's differences between Southeast Asians and those who are not. We know the differences even between Latino children, right? Those who are Mexican versus Central American versus Cuban. The same thing with Black children, right? Those who are from the Caribbean versus from the continent of Africa, those who are part of the descendants of enslaved people. So again, while this is sort of broad and says a pattern, I do want to make note that there are differences within groups. However, though, we do see this consistent pattern, whether we're looking at reading and math, or things, these are executive function skills, right? No matter what we're looking at, we do continue to see sort of this gap between Black children, Latino children, Native children, in comparison to particularly white children. And that's above and beyond income. So this is something important I want to highlight. Most people think it's all an income issue. This says that above and beyond income, maternal education, and everything else that we throw into our analyses, these gaps still exist. So the question is, why is that? It is not for us to say that Black children, Latino children, other children of color are less than. It is actually the outcome and the output of systemic racism and other forms of racism that create these gaps that we see. So that's something important that I want to note. And then finally, I do just want to sort of highlight that when we look at sort of the percent of children by race, ethnicity, and kindergarten proficiency, we do continue to see sort of the gaps between between obviously Black children and Latino children. And if you see the Black children, Latino children is lower, it just continues to tell us that no matter what, we can, early childhood is important, but there's much larger forces and contexts that Black children, Latino children, and other children of color are really exposed to, that place them at risk, and so may not be quote unquote proficient, whether in letter recognition. And this is actually, I think this is actually, is this Oregon's data? I think, I can't remember, but I think it's actually Oregon's data. And so in many ways, we need to actually be very cognizant that we're not trying to intervene on children, but rather addressing more of the programmatic and systematic issues that lead to the gaps that we see. Tanya?
I just got so caught up in what you were saying. I was like, "Woo, go ahead, Dr. Ruka." And I forgot it was my turn. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is shift. We'll actually continue with the conversation. And we wanted to bring in a little bit of historical data. So what you see on your screen is in the late 80s and the early 90s, there was really big boom of multicultural education, anti-bias education. Dermot Sparks' first book of anti-bias education was published in 1989. So this big, huge, momentum in early childhood and also in elementary ed on culturally relevant teaching, culturally responsive teaching. So it's all of this research and this theory that came out about, wait a minute, we really need to focus in on bringing the lived experiences of Black and Brown children into the classroom. So that was culturally relevant teaching. And then we had anti-bias education from Dermot Sparks that said, you know what, we also need to do culturally relevant teaching, but we also need to teach very explicitly all children, particularly white children as well, how to be anti-bias, how to be anti-racism, how to be anti-racist, how to fight against sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, etc. So we had these huge, focus on culturally relevant, teaching and research. So that was the 90s, right? So we're now here in 2021. So you would think that with 40 plus years of research and really focusing and a lot of lip service and a lot of policies and, a lot of rhetoric about cultural relevancy and about equity and anti-bias, that we would see trends that are significantly different. That's not what we're finding. What we're finding, as you see, that in some cases, particularly with Black and Brown children, the results, the academic achievement has either stayed the same or gotten worse, even though we have many more examples of how to make teaching and learning more accessible and more relevant and more equitable for children. And so here on the screen, you'll see the national reading level for fourth grade, because we do all this work in early childhood and talk about the early beginnings, but what happens, as we continue this work and by fourth grade. And so you'll see here, yet again, for the scores, we have Black and Brown children, particularly, Black and those children who are identified as Hispanic, who are, and Native Americans, who are among the lowest in terms of reporting. Go ahead. So that's the national data. And this is just probably a bigger kind of perception. And I'm pulling these slides just so you can see the visual, all right? And I want you to take it away from the students and what we're doing in our systems, in our educational frameworks. What is our responsibility? Because we have 40 years of research that tells us what to do and that has shown for it to be effective. So we have empirical data. So what's happening here? Okay, next slide. Let's look at Oregon and say, okay, that's national, that's not Oregon. What do we notice? Yet again, what do we notice about our trends? And you'll see that Black has a little line, and that's because in Oregon, 2% of your population, roughly about 2% of your population, your child population is African-American or Black. And so for this particular national data, and that's also what Ioma was mentioning, is the limitations to the data that we do have. So there's data there. And I definitely encourage you to pull up your local level data, your school level data, your program level data about from a demographic perspective. So look at the data based on race, look at the data based on language, native language, and look at the data based on economics, okay?
And I'll just insert real quick. So when you look, for example, mean that Portland being your biggest city that actually has more diversity, we do see a similar pattern of sort of where you have your Black children in particular not doing as well as your other peers, particularly your white peers. So you have to go to the big city to kind of get some of that Black data.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And this is math. So again, the same results, right? So we can go straight through, the lens here and still see how are our native, children doing, our Black and Brown children, Latino, Latinx children, those of multiple races. And you'll see consistently, some of the disparities and the issues across the years. Next slide. And this is the most recent data that we have, and you'll also see the interesting stereotype that we have related to Asian students and related to mathematics. And so we have to also be very careful with this stereotype to not automatically assume that Asian students would, and particularly outscore and do well. And this is in some cases an example of a positive bias, right? That we have of Asian students where they are in many terms automatically placed in accelerated mathematics, or given higher expectations because of the presumption that they bring advanced mathematical skills. And so just imagine if all of our students, particularly our Black and Brown students, already had the high expectations from every teacher that they were gifted in mathematics. Will we see the same results that we see with our Asian student population? Next slide. And this is Oregon. All right. So again, we see the differences here, not only the disparities, but also the gap. I noticed in the next slide, Yomi, I noticed in the chat box that someone mentioned about the opportunity gap, and that's exactly the case. Now let's look at the dropout rates. As you can see, the dropout rates has declined. You can go to the next slide over in the past almost 10 years or so. And these are the particular graduation rates. So we had the dropout rates, and these are the graduation rates. And the graduation rates are the highest for Asian Pacific Islander, and are the lowest for American Indian, African American, and Hispanic. So again, we must take a look. You can go to the next slide at the systemic issues. This is a national landscape. So you'll see Oregon, and this is a percentage of graduation rates. So you'll see in Oregon, you're at an 80%, rate. So nationally, look at the states in the dark green. They have the highest graduation rates. So one of the states that actually surprised me was Texas. That surprised me was Texas. Don't ask me why, but it surprised me. And what surprised me about Texas is that Texas does have a very ethnically, and linguistically diverse population. And so as a part of that, we have to, wonder what are some of the states and our counter states that we can lean on to get a little bit of insights on why you may have a really high graduation rate. Okay, next slide. A part of one of the things we want to challenge you to think about when we talk about equity and creating equitable spaces is one of the things that you can do immediately is to really take note of who's in the gifted and talented programs. Who is, when you have this transition for your preschoolers to kindergarten, because we have feeder schools, and as professionals, we definitely have plans, and we have preschool readiness, or school readiness plans and assessments. Who are the children that are positioned to be in the talented or gifted program? Who are the children that we talk about with lens of exceptionality? Who are the children that we talk about that instead may need IEP services, educational interventions? And break that down first, starting by race, and then by native language, and then by economics. All right. And as you see here in the US, you'll see, again, our delineation based on race of gifted and talented. And we really have to address this as a systemic issue, the disproportionate number of Black and Brown children, particularly Black boys, and also an increasing of Black girls that are placed in special education services, and the disproportionate number of them not being referred to gifted education. The same with our Latinx children, that a disproportionate number of them are placed in English language learning services, and there being a really huge discrepancies between a cultural difference and a language difference and a language need. Okay, next slide. And when we think about long-term outcomes, right? So when we think about access, it starts very early on in early childhood that Ioma has already mentioned. It starts off with, well, who has access to a high quality learning experience? And for Black and Brown children, it's not just high quality, it's also high quality and culturally relevant and anti-racist and equitable. So if all of those things in place, once they get into kindergarten, who then has access to an academic accelerated track that's still equitable, that's still culturally relevant, that places students into positions where they can accelerate. If I don't have opportunities for children to take advantage of an accelerated track, then I also don't have opportunities for when they become into secondary education to take advanced placement courses. All right. So this trajectory of either I need special, education services or remedial services versus accelerated track begins in early childhood and continues through their entire career. So we have to ask ourselves, why are some children in 9th, 10th grade able to almost complete 2 years of college services before they even graduate or finish 10th and 11th grade, and why some children do not even have access to a college education until 2 years after they graduate from high school. And when we look at those numbers, we will see that it is yet again disproportionately Black and brown children who don't have the access. So that's why we're really kind of focusing in this first question in on access. Yama?
Yes. And it's funny, as you were talking, somebody, Johnny Lake, put in, so there was obviously the conversation on opportunity gap. I kind of want to just make note of that. And in the chat, I found this interesting. So I wasn't sure, so whether this at risk, so being a minority equals at risk, question mark. And Johnny Lake, him, basically says that at risk is defined as the following. There's a whole lot of other factors like entering school not ready to learn, due to factors but not limited to living in poverty or in unsafe housing, living in a household where there's significant or undocumented domestic conflict, violence, etc., having a parent who suffers from mental illness, living in circumstances which there is neglect or abuse, having racial ethnic minority status that is historically consistent with disproportionate overrepresentation in academic achievement gaps or in the systems of child welfare, foster care, or juvenile or adult corrections. When you read it, so this one is one of those where I feel like I have to kind of process it, right? Because a lot of times we do see sort of at risk, especially when we think about federal or even statewide sort of, guide to prioritize access, right? They do say at risk includes, maternal education, poverty, speaking a language other than English. And so I guess, am I to assume that this one is Oregon's one in terms of access to early childhood programming or services? If somebody can let me know, I think that's important, right? Is to say, is this sort of a nod to say that we recognize that it's not about your skin color, but is the fact of what your skin color represents, right? That it represents the historical systemic inequities that have placed particular groups in exactly child welfare, as we've seen, when we removed, Native children, et cetera, or even for Black children as well, or juvenile adult correction. So I guess I would like to, I'm very curious, Tanya, about what you think about that particular sort of list.
Absolutely. So one of the things I want us to consider, the whole purpose of us starting off with systemic issues related to equity and the education of Black and brown children is to shift the focus away from the Black and brown children, because they're not the issue, we're the issue. The system is the issue, the teacher is the issue. So let's move away from the labels of disadvantage, at risk children to we're putting them in disadvantage, at risk situations. So let's first shift our narrative. And then let me give you a little story. I'll give you an example, a very specific example. So I was in an at risk situation, right? Growing up, or what would be the standard definitions of at risk. So we had limited financial resources. We were in lower quality, not regulated, early childhood, care and education. So there are all these different, systems that were impacting my family and my community. I also was placed in, and I went to all of the feeder schools in my community. And so when I was transitioned to high school, and I've always excelled, I went to a community-based early childhood program where I actually did first grade in my early childhood program. But when I got to public schools, which was mostly ran by then a very controlled white school board, I was told I could not go to first grade because because they didn't recognize my education in the community school, I had to be put back to kindergarten. So already starting off, I wasn't able to, and my mom fought it. But again, that goes to what we're going to talk about a little bit later about the advocacy, the agency, and the power and the influence and not of families. And because of who my mother was and what she looked like, her and my father and the community we came from immediately shut down. So I was automatically placed back into kindergarten. So fast forward to high school. When it was time for me to go to high school, in my community, high school started at 8th grade. So when it was time for me to go to high school, there was this big movement of integration. It was called the M2M program, where they wanted to integrate minorities to majorities. So they were trying to integrate white students into Black schools. And in order to draw white students to our particular school, which was predominantly African-American, they created a magnet program, right? And so the magnet program was a STEM focused, smaller classrooms, all field-based, practice-based. They got to do their advanced placement classes starting in 10th grade. As a resident student, we weren't able to do it into 11th and 12th grade. Our parents in the community came together and said, we need our, bright and best students that are here in the community to have access to the program, and was told no. So that's another systemic issue, and an example, very personal example of how even within the same community, how there are barriers to advancent of children, and that's very real. So I want you to think about ways in which we place children and youth at risk and put them in disadvantaged situations.
Thank you for that, right? Thank you. I think that you showed sort of the power of storytelling and how that helps to really crystallize how racism sort of, is touching families and children on a daily basis and a moment-to-moment basis, Tanya. So thank you for noting that. So I know we have just a few minutes for this first part before we enter into sort of our small group conversation. I just want to kind of just share a couple of things for those who may be like, what are some things that I can do, particularly those who are leaders and have, control of governances or boards or engage in that space. So I will, again, I would say, we're trying to really center equity. We're trying to center justice and fairness. And as I said earlier, we are at a crossroads, right? Whether due to, COVID-19 has made us maybe focus a little bit more, but also obviously the racial reckoning, which came about because we had to witness the murder of a Black man on camera for 8 minutes and 47 seconds. We should think about why that took that, but let's move on. But also we do see generation change in funding coming into early care education for families and young children. So there are some things that are really happening. Again, I said generation change in funding, but we have to see how it's actually spent in states. And so, part of equity is what we're solely hoping to push you on, is to sort of think about how do we actually protect children, right? That is our job as adults. Children don't come in here and say, oh my God, yes, please make sure I live in poverty. Look, I didn't say, oh yes, let me live in the projects of Boston. That was not what I came for, right? But so how do we protect children from poverty, from all the psychological trauma that we adults, really, and particularly systems have put in their warehouse? How do we promote their well-being, their cultural identity, their sense of self, their ownership and agency of their words, of their language, of their bodies? And then how do we preserve, right, the cultural identities, the cultural roots that people have? How do we preserve their brilliance and their excellence in many ways? This is our job as adults to figure out, and not for children themselves to do that. And so with that in mind, colleagues and organizations have sort of, identified at least 14 policies to begin to dismantle systemic racism in early care education. We won't go into the history of early care education, but it is in our book. We talk about, early childhood. Yes, it is the bastion of love, of enriching opportunities, but like everything else in America, it is seeped in racism. How it originated has a level of racism, and while we are still in a bifurcated system, while we still have those who, early care education professionals who are essential workforce that had to remain open, versus those who were able to stay at home because they worked at school or pre-K based programs. So again, we sort of push on what are the 14 things that we can begin to do. And so I won't sort of take this time to sort of go through all of it, but I will say that they're really centered on the issue of access, which we've talked about a lot, which includes equitable funding, right? We need to have funding, but also distribute it. So for those who are getting, we know almost every state is getting some level of American Rescue Plan funding. How you use it is going to matter. Think about authentic integration. Tanya talked about the notion that we desegregated, we never actually integrated. And when we did, we lost a lot of Black teachers who are never to come back. And how do we also center family childcare homes and, friend and family neighbor care? That is where the majority of children are, the majority of Black and brown children, and the majority of infants and toddlers are in those programs. And then how do we think about equity in early intervention and special education, but also, as Tanya has noted, in gifted and talented programming, right? This is about access to equitable opportunities in many ways. And then second, experiences. Once you get in, it's not like, okay, we're done. What you actually have, right? For kids to be able to experience, have a high quality, culturally grounded experience, we have to have a workforce that is well-trained, that's also well compensated. You can't make $10 an hour and think you're going to be okay. That's not reality, especially not in Oregon, they're not, right? We have to think about preparing our workforce, right? To really center equity, to really center what does it mean for all children to have agency and language. Think about our quality rate improvement systems or any of your quality initiatives. Think about sort of eliminating harsh discipline. Think about family engagement and leadership and governance in all your programming. What about culture responsive curriculum and pedagogy, right? So these are all the things to really make sure that children have the best experiences. We have to not just think about the echoes in the class, but think about all the people that touch children. Think about all the standards that you have. And then for us to actually have the outcomes that we seek, right? We have to have equity in monitoring and accountability. We can't just measure just reading the math, right? Are there other things that we need to measure? What are the supports we're providing to teachers, to staff, to programs? What about, anything about continuous quality improvement? What are we centering on? Are we ensuring that teachers are actually doing the best for children and not engaging in microaggressions or biased interactions? And then how about just access to dual language learning, right, for children? We have a lot of dual language programs, but a lot of children who are actually DLLs don't access it, which is interesting, right? So again, we're thinking about access, experiences, and outcomes. And then I'll just end with this note about, for us to really do anti-bias into races, I would say we have to really engage in being richer. What does that mean? I would just say easily and quickly that we have to re-educate ourselves about our history. We do not know our history, me included. I went to what I would say is one of the best public institutions in high school, Boston Latin School, where all the old presidents went. I had to unlearn and relearn the history of America when I became in my 30s. That's a problem. We have to think about integration rather than just desegregation, right? Desegregation just says, okay, now just stop all the formalized, separation. But how do we truly integrate our hearts, our minds, but also our brilliance, right, across economic, racial, and cultural groups? We have to learn to critique every single thing that we have. We can't assume that early kid education, all the standards are great, all the assessments are great, or everything that they do is great. We need to critique and really ask ourselves why, how, who, and what, and under what circumstances. And then we have to show humility in our privilege. All of us sit in some level of privilege, including my little brown self, right? There's some privilege I have. I have a PhD, right? Hello, right? So we have to think about the privilege that we operate in and how that comes across in our policies, our practices, our interactions with families and children. And of course, if we are not focused on erasing racism, then all we're doing is pretty much just being complicit in engaging racism and other forms of isms, from whether it's sexism, xenophobia, etc. We need to attend to race in the system that historically that really oppresses people from access and opportunities. And then finally, we have to have the vision, right? To think about different ways of being, different approaches, different theories, different measures, different systems. We have to have that ability if we're trying to be a much enriched country that's going to provide all the opportunities that we proclaim that we want to give to everybody. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and sharing, and I know we'll be going to breakout shortly. Tanya, if you have anything else to add, please do, darling.
No, you dropped the mic. So we have hopefully set the stage for some systemic things for you to talk about in your breakout. And given the time, we want to honor everyone's time and the agenda. So we will go ahead and hand it over to our host about next steps.
Wow. Thank you so much. This is such an important grounding in our state and our local history, as well as the national context, right? And reflecting on our own stances on anti-bias and anti-racist education and how that impacts our programs and practices. And I love just asking ourselves, what are we willing to do, right? So We are about to have some time to process these questions and others that have come up around early childhood experiences and the data that y'all have shared with us for the past hour. You're going to move into a brief breakout group discussion to digest some of that. These will be groups, random groups of 3, and we'll present the opportunity to first introduce yourselves. Allie's putting the directions in the chat here. Thank you so much. So you'll introduce yourselves and then share up to 3 insights, 2 questions, and an implication for your team planning later on today. And if you won't be present for the afternoon work, just think through 1 implication for your own team or your program work in general. So keep in mind, this is just a guide. If time doesn't allow to share all 3, 2, 1, share 1 of each. It's really just important to get our juices flowing and to start processing what we've heard. So identify somebody who can record your notes and your takeaways into the Google Doc that was linked in the chat and you should have received, it's called the Notes and Early Learning Academy Notes and Reflections document that you should have received via email on Monday from Yanni. So with that, I will pass it to Allie to send us off into our breakout groups. If there are any questions, just remember you can raise your hand in your group. All right, it is 10:29. We'll get ready to resume here in about a minute or 2. I'm gonna give everybody a little bit of time to come back in. Welcome, welcome back. As people are returning, I just want to highlight, I really like this last comment that we got in the chat box before we left. And particularly, I think it's really important that we keep in mind what it looks like for us to be courageous in our actions, right? And that the system is steeped in dominant cultural practices, and we've been afraid to throw much of that out because it's familiar, right? And I'd stretch that a little further and say, I think that it can be terrifying to name the dominant culture and to name some of these inequities, but it's so powerful once we are, and showing that courage and naming it and starting the conversation is a powerful first step. And so it might feel daunting, but just starting the conversation and naming these observations can be really, really powerful in our practice and our program and in our interpersonal relationships and work. So I see a lot of people are back now. It is 10:31. I am so happy to turn it back over to Dr. Durden and Dr. Yuruka for the second part of their keynote speech. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it. Tanya, I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing, or did you want to say something before?
No,
Okay.
Go right ahead. Let's jump right into it.
Okay. Okay.
All right, you want me to take it away?
Yes.
All right, so we're going to now transition our discussion to really talking about some very practical implications for this kind of systemic work that we set you up with earlier. So we're going to talk a little bit about transitions, family engagement, instruction through an anti-bias lens. And before I go on to the next slide, I want to also talk just very briefly about language and the power of language, right? So we ended our conversation about at-risk, disadvantage, minority even, these are all terms in which we place labels that we place on children that are deficit. And so we have to shift it to the actual systems and as well as the situations that we put children in our educational system. And so we also have to think about what we are now using as we welcome children and families back into the classroom face-to-face after COVID. So I know a lot of the terms that I'm hearing is learning loss. Oh my gosh, we have to address learning loss. Well, let's shift again that language to not focusing on learning loss, but focusing on the opportunities that we now have as educators and leaders to see what children have been learning and the funds of knowledge that they've gained and the experiences they've gained from being in virtual school or at home and in their community, and et cetera. I like to personalize everything because I have lots of examples now with my children being home. Praise it. This whole year, again, I have a 1-year-old, 3-year-old, and 5-year-old. And so if my children's teachers was to ask me, well, instead of, what are you concerned about from this past year? Instead of asking me that, they could instead ask, well, what are some of the wonderful adventures and learning experiences and cool things that you guys have engaged in this year? What skills, have they demonstrated and shown you? I would gladly answer all of those questions. One particular example for my soon-to-be 5-year-old, she's an engineer. She has learned how to put back together the globe, the desk, the chair, everything she's taken apart, all the furniture she's taken apart. Engineering, that's engineering. She's learned how to put it back together when she took it apart. She's also learned some really good negotiation, expressive language tactics, especially during hair day. So that's my 5-year-old. My 3-year-old has learned quantity. So a part of what I do with his sister, because she's 5, or soon to be 5, I'll give them their age. So if it's a M&Ms, I'll give her 5 M&Ms and give him 3 M&Ms. He's learning quantity. He knows that, wait a minute, 5 is more than 3. So what's going on here? And then my baby, who's 1 year of age, he has learned empathy. So when either his sister or his brother is crying or is sad, he's learned to engage now in cooing. So he coos them and he pats them on the head and he has like his little cooing moment. So those are opportunities for us to really take a step back and say, okay, let's seek from families, let's seek from children the funds of knowledge that they're actually bringing with them back to our schools and our programs. Okay, next slide. So I want you to address this and be thinking about this in the chat. So how can you, as an early childhood leader, as an administrator, really begin to operate from an anti-racist and equity lens? And when we talk about racism, we talk about a lot of the things that we've already mentioned earlier. So we talk about this very specific discrimination and oppression and inequitable treatment of children and families based on their race. And particularly in our country, it has been a historical legacy of African-American children that have been discriminated against. And we see that more and more also with our Latinx children as well. So next slide. So when we talk about, this systemic racism, when we talk about, we've already showed you all the data, that demonstrates that even though we have all of these strategies that tells us what to do and how to do it. And Dr. Asa Hilliard was a huge pioneer in this work, said if we have the will. So if we had the will, then we really would see changes. And so since we don't see those changes, then now what do we do next? How do we really focus in on creating an anti-racist and equitable learning experience? Well, I want you to think back on and just envision for a second your classrooms, whether you are in an elementary school, whether you're in a early childhood program, whatever space you're in, which image best describes that setting, right? What we know from our research and our own experiences, my own experience as a mother and also as a teacher, is we see far more Black and brown children that reflect the picture where you have to walk in a straight line, you have to have your hands behind your back, and it's very much modeling this term that we talk about, this school to prison pipeline. So that's just one example that children can use their bodies, in order to engage in learning experiences, that they're very much restricted. Just like in prison, you have to sit still, you have to walk in a straight line, hands behind your back, instead of really being able to use their bodies and their movement as a form of expression and as a form of engagement. And not only do we see differences by race, but we also see differences in economics as well. So we see it across our different school systems, where if you're in a higher economic community, then it's more likely you'll see images like those at the bottom at the top, where children are free, have the autonomy, have the right, and have the expectations that they can engage freely and not have to be in such a restrictive environment. So again, as a part of our conversation where we're thinking about equity, we have to first think about what are our expectations, not only as it relates to learning and our instructional practices, but also discipline, and also how we envision children. So the children have rights. Do we perceive them as being capable, or do we perceive them as having to control their thoughts, their curiosities, and their learning experiences? And if we envision our own children as the opposite, then why do we envision other children in that manner? Next. So a part of that conversation is also looking at the different ways in which we deliver instruction, right? As you can see, the learning experiences will vary. Do we really engage in cooperative, critical thinking, hands-on? I use my body, I use my movement, I use my language, I use my expressive skills to really figure out this problem, and the teacher is the guide? Or am I expected to sit down, crisscross applesauce on the carpet and wait my turn to speak? All right. So yet again, when I talk a little bit about culturally relevancy and anti-bias education, we cannot have these conversations without talking about equity, okay? Because those best practices that we elevate in early childhood and in elementary ed and et cetera are important practices, but they're not delivered equitably across racial lines and ethnically and linguistically diverse settings. And so we have to ask the question, why? Why? And when I ask that questions to teachers, often what I get is, well, our children can't sit still, or our children interrupt. Oh, our children can't read, or our children can't learn as quickly, or our children don't have language. So I get these type of responses where my response back is, well, that's interesting. However, we're professionals. And when we say things like children can't read or can't sit, that's not being accurate. Right? Instead, we have to reframe and think about the ways our own expectations for all of our children and what their rights are and their capabilities are as well. Next slide. So start there first. Vision your classroom. What does it look like? What do we expect from children? Is it a shared learning? So I want to take a very brief moment to talk about the differences between anti-bias, anti-racist education and culturally relevant education, because sometimes they're kind of talked together, but they're really separate but equal. So when we talk about anti-bias education very specifically focuses on first, our own identity as professionals. So looking at the different identities that we bring to the classroom, they're not separate. We can't leave our home selves and our cultural selves at home from when we come into the classroom. So I am a Black woman, I'm spiritual, I was born and raised in Atlanta. And so I have all of these identities and experiences that I bring with me. And I'm an in-your-face kind of person, so I'm that kind of teacher as well. We teach who we are, right? We lead who we are. So that's inevitable that we bring that. And so part of anti-bias education is for me to immediately check the biases that I bring with me to the table and to ensure that I'm creating opportunities and not barriers. So that's one part of anti-bias education. The other part of anti-bias education is to then intentionally implement curriculum, interactions, and experiences, not just during diversity week, not just when, a situation occurs, but every single day, put it at the forefront of your teaching and learning about how we can be equitable, fair, and just. And anti-bias is a very big umbrella term. So it could be related to gender bias, ableism, xenophobia, racism. So looking at bias very broadly and helping children to really develop this empathy and this understanding of ways in which we can be and we are biased and what we can do to combat it and to address it and to be more fair and to be equitable. And so, one of the things that are going on right now, like we have all these events that are going on, and I've been just so very excited because again, I have young children and I get all the time from teachers, oh, this is not developmentally appropriate to talk about Black Lives Matter, to talk about gerrymandering, to talk about voting rights, to talk about the Capitol riots. It's not appropriate to talk about with 4-year-olds. I talk about it with my 1-year-old, and it is appropriate. It is what's going on in our world because we're talking about it as a family, we're talking about it as a community, and it is a way to talk about it appropriately. So I'll give you an example. So again, anti-bias practices focus very specifically on looking at issues in our society and our community that impact us. So classroom, community, and in larger context, and then bring it into the classroom and say, well, let's talk about it and let's examine it and let's create a solution. So there's all types of standards, of course, in early learning guidelines that we address with that, from receptive to receptive, expressive to receptive language, to, of course, all the social emotional domains and the cognitive processing. All of those things, you know, are addressed by anti-bias education. And so there's two big things that have been dominating in the news recently that I've debriefed with my own children. One of which is historical events. So we have historical events that have become current events. So one historical event, of course, is all of this talk about the Tulsa massacre, right? And so I kind of shared with my daughter, who's 5 or 4, soon to be 5, about Tulsa massacre, but of course in a developmentally appropriate way. And again, they get it, you know, when you connect it to someone coming in and taking over property and toys, et cetera, so they get that. And so after sharing with her kind of, you know, this historical event and how both sides of the story, you know, felt and their experiences, you know, I just posed a question, what do you think should happen now? Because now there's conversations with the, you know, the descendants, vocabulary development, the descendants of those who were impacted by this really, really, really awful event. What do you think should happen? Do you think that they should get their land back, their property back, their homes back? Do you think they should get paid for it? Do you think the people who are living there now will have to give up their lands now? And my daughter, and all her awesomeness as 4-year-olds do, said, well, why don't they share? Can we think about ways that they can share? Like when I have to share my toys with my brothers. So children really are able to process very complex thoughts and ideas, and able to really brainstorm more than adults, ways in which we can live in this world and in this space equitably, responsibly, and respectfully. Another example is the Juneteenth. We've always celebrated Juneteenth in my household. So my children know about Juneteenth, but they know the truth about Juneteenth. So this is where I'm really concerned about this movement. It's really political. It's not educational. It's all political, about critical race theory, because the rhetoric that I'm hearing about Juneteenth is absolutely false. So the rhetoric that I'm hearing is that, oh, we celebrate Juneteenth because that's when the slaves found out that they were free 2 years later. That's not true. They knew that they were free. Let's talk about the context from which they were not free and they were held for 2 years, right? So we have, again, these gaps where we bring in the history where we can talk about it and infuse in our classroom, but we're still perpetrating, as Ioma mentioned earlier, misinformation. So we have to unlearn what we thought we knew in the vein of saying, I am being culturally relevant and I am addressing anti-bias, but that's not true. So one of the things that a part of anti-bias education that I mentioned earlier is, as educators, we have to be equipped with the full knowledge, the full history, and the full understanding prior to integrating it into the classroom with young children. And we also have to be vulnerable, and we have to be willing to learn from children, learn from families, learn from history, and also to be uncomfortable in these spaces as well. Next slide. So what is culturally relevant? So anti-bias is looking very specifically about my own stuff that I bring to the classroom and how that creates barriers. And it also helps children to very explicitly look at biases and isms in the classroom, in the larger society, and ways to address it. Now, culturally relevant pedagogy, on the other hand, really is an instructional approach, and it's also a belief and way of being. So it focuses on a community of learners, this reciprocity of learning. Too often we're like, I'm the teacher, I got the knowledge. I'm the administrator, I got the knowledge. I tell teachers what to do, I know what's right. Teachers, I got all the knowledge, I'm gonna tell you what to do. That's not the approach of culturally responsiveness. One of the things I tell my teachers and the leaders all the time, if you are not learning from children, you're not teaching. Not sure what you're doing, but you're not teaching. You absolutely have to be the learner of children, of families, in order to be effective and equitable in teaching, all right? Also, there's this very clear focus on collaborative learning and experiences and generating knowledge, pulling and mining them out. So this perception that children already come with them, key skills, knowledge, and information, and that it's just my guide and my responsibility to just pull it on out because it's already there. They're capable, they're competent, competent and they're amazing. All right. So having that framework, and that there's also very clear connections between the child, the family, the community, and their national and global identities as well. One of my advisors, who's still a mentor to me today, Dr. Joyce King, always used to stress to us as I was preparing to be a teacher early in my career is do not start the history, of Black people with slavery. And so that's very important when we have in any history book, in any conversation during Black History Month, all of the topic is focused on slavery and civil rights, and it doesn't talk about the lineage of excellence from which we came across the African diaspora. And so it's those type of unlearning that we have to examine. And it's very important when we think about the connections between anti-bias education or culturally relevant education, that this is not a Black and brown thing, right? So anti-bias education is, if I have all white children in my classroom, you still implement anti-bias education. You still teach about, truthfully, Juneteenth. You still teach about inequities that are going on and that impact other people in our community, right? So you still have these conversations. You not just have these conversations when you have Black and brown children in your classroom, is what I'm trying to say. All right, next step. And so this is just kind of a framework. It looks at identity, equity, developmentally appropriateness, teaching the whole child, student-teacher relationships. So I'm not going to go into them in detail because I've kind of already summarized them just briefly in a second. And so I know what you're saying. Oh my gosh, that's just good teaching. I know that I'm supposed to be responsive to children. I'm supposed to connect to their culture and their language. I know that that's good teaching. However, we don't see it. We showed you the data. It's not happening. It's not happening. Putting a book of a brown child in the classroom is not culturally relevant teaching. Having one conversation about women's rights is not anti-bias education. It has to be deeply ingrained in your thought processes and in the ways in which you teach. It's a whole different paradigm shift from what I've observed when I am doing my professional development as well as training teachers. This is a total shift in really constructing with children the learning environment and the experiences and being uncomfortable and okay to say, I don't know everything and I'm willing to learn and I'm excited to learn. And that's the only way that I can be equitable and high quality is to learn from you. All right, next step. So one example of this, one of the things that Dr. Tanya Washington is no longer at our university. She's in California, and she has really been a huge pioneer in African-American vernacular and even getting it recognized that it's a language. Y'all, I speak two languages. I speak English and African-American vernacular, but all the grants I try to write for say, no, we don't recognize Black English as a language, although it has substantial research that documents the complexity of a language and qualifies it as a language. So this is just one example of many examples in which we really have to think about how we view children and how we even put resources and support to even elevate equity. Because if I don't have equitable opportunities to engage with teachers who even recognize that Black English is a language, then I don't have opportunities to engage in bilingual education, right? And it's not in the programs, my teacher ed programs, it's not a part of my professional development experiences. Same with our Native children, right? So we have to really rethink the cultural narratives and the experiences and the voices that are not in our educational systems and the ways in which we teach children, okay?
And if I could just add one thing, I feel like, this is an important point to, I think, note, right, Tanya, about this idea of language, particularly of African-American English vernacular, that when, it's not just even it was made political back in the Ebonics, but what is really important, I think Tanya said beautifully, is the fact of if children are coming with their home language and we're not supporting them, right? Because part of us sort of really supporting children's language is using their first language or their home language to support whatever the school language is, as Barbara Bowman would say. And so the fact that we continue to now recognize that Black children in particular, have a language they bring with them, and we see them as less than. So there's a lot of this compounded inequities, compounded biases that Black children in particular, and then obviously obviously those who are also from tribal communities are also experiencing that. If you don't recognize my language as language, then you're not only oppressing my language, you're oppressing my ability to truly be engaged in the classroom. And you also see me as less than, as not speaking the English language or the King's tongue. And I think there's something to be said about the power or the removal of power from children because we don't do that. So thank you, Tanya.
Yes, a shade of shame. So these are kind of the 4 big goals as we connect cultural relevancy and anti-bias education, that they will first demonstrate self-awareness, confidence, family pride, and positive social identities. That's very key, you know, is this positive racial identity. One of my amazing colleagues from when I was in the Midwest created this theory about chosen and unchosen identities, right? So as Black and brown people, we often don't get to choose the identity that society portrays us as. You know, I see myself as amazing. I am amazing. I'm a genius. I'm quick-witted on the feet, as Taylor Swift says. I can drop it like I said. I'm amazing. However, when I walk into the room, sometimes, and it depends on how my hair is, if I have my afro, if I have my hair straight, it really depends the identities that people place onto me just from walking into a room. And as you notice, I'm a light-skinned Black woman. So when I'm, you know, with my colleagues who are of darker skin, it's amazing, right? The perceptions before we even open up our mouths, the identities that are placed upon us. And we carry that with us, right? And what we did talk about earlier that I think we have to mention in this particular slide is the experiences of racial trauma, that it really is real. And a part of really addressing racial trauma, and when I say racial trauma, I mean the ongoing impact, or the impact that one has by seeing negative images of themselves in the media, in schools, in society, by seeing their community members being brutalized, being murdered, by seeing our voices, our experience not recognized, by seeing laws that are being passed that are taking away our rights, our freedoms, our voice. That is traumatic. That's very traumatic. And it also goes against the anti-bias and culturally relevant goals of creating a positive social identity. How can I grow up to be to think in my mind, because in my mind and my parents have taught me that I'm amazing, Black magic, Black girl, but society is telling me something different, and it's portraying something different in their actions. And so a part of culturally relevancy and anti-bias that has been doing this since the 80s, this isn't something from 2021, has been telling us since 1989 is this is critical to making sure that all children are created equally in their educational experiences and also have equal access. And we are not going to be able to even move the needle if we don't educate all of our children, including ourselves and white children as well. So I'm going to fly through this very briefly because I want the opportunity for you to, you know, definitely get a lot of information about families. And I'm going to give you the context around these principles. A part of the work that Iome and I do is personal, and it's also professional. And what I'm going to share with you is not only from research and our scholarship, but also our lived experiences. So I'm a teacher, educator, researcher, and I'm a teacher. That's who I do, and I'm a parent. And so I know this because I've done it. And so I'm able to provide very specific examples of ways in which I myself was a culturally relevant teacher, because I believe in not, you know, sharing with you what I can't already do and what I can't model and what I can't back it up. I talk like this because I can back it up. I told you Beyonce was, you know, on my mind. And so it's important as you think about the different strategies that I'm providing, don't question it, just do it, because I've done it and I've proven success in doing it. So first principle of culturally relevancy is professionals first must believe that all students can succeed, period. That's it, no questions, no but he has an IEP, but she doesn't speak another language, speak a different language, but no buts. But she comes from a single parent, but, you know, she's in traumatic. No buts. All children can succeed and capable. Also, we have to maintain affirming student-teacher relationship. I've met teachers that don't like children. Ask yourself, do you really like children? Do you really like children? Do you like people? I've met teachers that really don't like people. So you need to ask yourself that question first. If you like children, you like families, or you like people. And if your answer is yes, 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 then we really have to work on having affirming and authentic relationships with children. And we see excellence, not your state standards, not your early learning guidelines, but excellence. And how do we know if we're implementing a standard of excellence? We learn from the children. The children tell us. We put children in a box and say, okay, by 2 years old, you should know this, 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 and this. Take that box away. Take those developmentally appropriate practices away, and instead center children and be amazed by children and what they can show you. How do I know? Ask me, how do I know? Well, my research focuses on excellence in urban education, excellence in Black education. I have seen 3-year-olds do calculus. Ask me how also I know. I know because my 4-year-old is on the verge of reading. That's how I know. Ask me again how I know. I can't wait to tell you. How I know is I have countless examples of extraordinary teachers who have actually implemented culturally relevant teaching, and their children has just absolutely soared beyond state standards and requirements. It's not what I read about, it's what I know and what I experience. Next slide. Ask me else, how else do I know? So this is early in my career, my 2nd grade classroom. And so we tried all kinds of innovative things. And at the time, I really didn't know what culturally relevant teaching was, but I was definitely, looking back in hindsight, a culturally relevant teacher. So this was our open classroom. We did a team teaching model with another teacher, myself. And as you see, look and see what you see children doing, right? So children are engaging with their bodies. They're moving. They're not sitting in their desk. If you could be there, you would hear all kinds of languages in the classrooms. And you see children spread out everywhere. Some are on the floor in the back. You can't see them on the floor in the back. This is a classroom that values learning, that values engagement, that values children. And then also a big part of what we didn't realize we were doing at the time is we brought in teachers who were learning to teach from the local community college to come in, as you see on the small picture, to also implement and to model, for us to model for them effective strategies. Again, ask me, how does culturally relevancy thing and high quality and anti-bias thing work? Does it really work? We were the highest in our district for test scores. And we were, quote, the Title I school, low income school, English language learner high, percentage school. Next slide. The second principle is culturally and socially mediated is learning. So everything is culturally and linguistically based. So children already come being amazing and having knowledge and theories and hypotheses. They all come with it already. They're already curious. It's our responsibility to learn from them. We got a lot of work to do. Next slide. And so here's another example. When I talked about anti-bias education, I talked about we don't begin with the standards and the early learning guidelines. We begin with what's happening in children's lives. So what's happening at home, their community, the larger society. So back in the day, in 2004, this is a picture of me way back in the day. This was persuasive writing. And so it was during an election cycle. And so the children had to engage, in this electoral process. So we went through the electoral process. We talked about the candidates. We talked about the community, and they had to actually demonstrate persuasively, both orally as well as in writing, why they were voting for a particular candidate. So, and we had all of the standards, that were met. So this is, again, one example that we bring the community and the experiences, because they're already talking about it, into the classroom and made it more applicable. Next slide. And again, I do this with preschoolers too. So this is not just an elementary example. This just happened to be, I think that's my 2nd grade classroom, but this just happened to be, a 2nd grade classroom. And we also have to understand the social political act of fostering equity. Next slide. So it goes beyond having, as I mentioned earlier, a book in the classroom, right? It's not only having instructional practices that center children's learning and their culture, but we also have to have an element of advocacy as well. And a part of that advocacy is saying, why do we have more children books that have animals than we have of African-American children, of Asian children, of Latinx children. And we only have 1% of our books about Native American. Why? So we have to ask these questions. And after we ask these questions, we need to write books that better represent children. And again, it's not just because we have a Native American in our classroom or a Black child in our classroom, but because we have them in our society. And it's because we have to have an equal representation, an equitable representation of all children in our classrooms, and talk about that. You know, one of the teachers that that's a part of my program did an amazing, unit author study about authors of color and also looking at books. And so with her 3-year-olds, they had an amazing integration of looking at, well, why do we have all of these books, of children that look like this and children that look like this, or characters. And so they really deconstructed, this whole element about diversity and fairness. And so that's another, subject, but it was an amazing, amazing focus. And again, a very good example of anti-bias and culturally relevant education. Next slide, as I wrap it up. Third principle, we have to intentionally focus on their cultural experiences and multiple literacies. Next slide. And so this goes back to that that element of reciprocity. What you see is joy. You see joy, you see laughter, you see I am just engaging with children, I'm learning with them, and they are learning, they are engaging, and they are teaching. So in this particular experience, the child with the red on and the black, she was the teacher. And so she was leading a guided reading session. So this is what culturally relevancy is all about. And this again could be implemented in early childhood classrooms, are implemented in early childhood classrooms in small groups where the children lead and guide, the instruction and joy. So I want you to ask yourself, above all, how are you creating joy? Dr. Golden Muhammad has an amazing book that focuses on joy and that focuses on equity in curriculum and in standards. And one of the central questions she asks is joy. How do you generate joy? Next slide. And so I want you to put that in the chat box. How do you create joy for the students in your classroom and your program? As my leaders, how do you create joy for the teachers who you lead and the staff that you lead? So please put that in the chat box. And then lastly, before I hand it over to the amazing Dr. Ruka, I checked, and Oregon does have a Chick-fil-A. So I want to end this discussion about instruction and anti-bias education with, we have to be more than an image. I've never experienced a school mission, a program mission that said, we're going to be racist, we're going to not implement anti-bias, anti-racist education. I've always experienced, mission statements that says, we develop the whole child, we're supportive, we're engaging, we want all children to succeed. So I use Chick-fil-A as an example, because their core values is customer first, personal excellence, continuous improvement, working together, stewardship. So when I used to eat at Chick-fil-A, it was an amazing experience. I absolutely loved Chick-fil-A. I always, felt that I was, first, that I came first. My food was always delicious, high quality food, high quality service, a wonderful experience. But when we peel back the layers and see the beliefs and where and the perceptions and what they stand for and put their money towards and what their beliefs are to certain individuals in our community, specifically the LGBTQI community, and how there's many instances of discrimination, then we have to take a step back and say, well, wait a minute. On the outside and the surface, we have all of these policies, we have all of these mission statements and this, whole curriculum on anti-bias education. But when we look at the children and how we may be discriminating against certain children in our schools, then it's not matching up. So I really encourage you to think very deeply the ways in which your mission, your intentions translate to actual actions as well, and whether you really are portraying a Chick-fil-A experience. And for all of us, even if we're not displaying a Chick-fil-A experience, if we know a school, a district, or a program that is engaging in a Chick-fil-A type of experience, then we're all held accountable, and we all have to reckon with that, because we have to speak up and speak out, and we have to challenge one another to make sure that we are all equitable in our teaching and our experience. And if we sponsor it, if we don't speak out about it, then we are just as, engaging in the discriminatory actions.
Well, you don't have to put that one in the chat box, Kaya. Are you displaying a Chick-fil-A experience? I feel like that's a whole new hashtag. And, if I have my Twitter open, I will be hashtagging that and saying that out loud. And I mean, I smile at that, but that is very true, right? In that many, many places, how many Black Lives Matter statements I have seen, but we actually have not seen much change in our policies, whether in schools, in our country. So I think it's exactly this performance, and then there's realness, right? So, and really authentic change. And so, so are you displaying a Chick-fil-A experience? That's everything, Tanya. So thank you. I mean, there was a lot happening in the chat box. And I'll say a couple of things that I took away other than, are you displaying a Chick-fil-A, are you displaying a Chick-fil-A experience? Are you, is the issue of Beyonce. So you're Beyonce now, Tanya, because of all of your Beyonce references. I think that's an important takeaway. We have Dr. Johnny Lake was dropping a whole lot of a whole history lesson in the chat box in many, many ways. So he needs to come up here and also be with us at some point in time, because he has a whole lesson that I have been taking while you have been giving us also lessons. So I want to thank you all for that. And I obviously want to also leave time for us to sort of engage as well, because I know, even, we're obviously virtual, so it's trying to get into that rhythm, but I think Tanya just left us with a lot of sort of, how do we think about anti-bias, anti-racist? How do we think about culturally responsive pedagogy? And I feel like that really aligns when we're talking about families, right? In the same ways that we think about what happens in a classroom, right? We also have to think about, how do we really engage with families? So think about it. During COVID-19, you could not call Johnny, Juanita, Joaquin, you could call anybody's child without actually talking to at least a parent, a family, a biological or community parent, or somebody of an adult, right? So this is where families are particularly important, even though unfortunately the history of early childhood, particularly for children from low income households, was really under the guise of, because your family is so pathological, we need to create a program that keeps them safe from you, or because we don't trust your families, we're going to take your children away and actually put them in sort of white family homes, right? That is actually a lot of early childhood in many ways, right? By actually trying to extricate children from their families, right? We saw, what happened with immigration policy from the former occupier of the White House. So this is sort of a pattern of the U.S. is to kind of always, in many ways, silence families. And so we need to kind of think about, how do we actually really do family engagement, and really, even family support, family, how do we actually engage in homeschool partnerships? Before I even go into all of that, even though Oregon has 2% Black people, we talk about Black people today. And it's funny, actually, when I was talking to my husband a while back, we were talking about Oregon actually in particular. I was like, how come Oregon only has 2%? Like forever and a day, like it has not grown. Usually populations grow, where we see the growing, Latino population, we see the growing Asian population. But how come Oregon, and then it's not just Oregon, only the 2% has been very, very steady. And it's like, why is that? And it's something I feel like the state should think about, right? And I would say it's probably because of the way the state started, right? When you even with all of your, I would say, amazingly progressive policies, like you were the only state that says we're going to take some of the CARES Act funding and specifically put it aside for Black people. Of course, you were sued, but at least you actually took a stance. But unfortunately, right, the question is, does your history continue to predate you that you can't grow the Black population? But nevertheless, though, I think the focus on Black people is important, because we are still the reminder of the promises America made that are still not been fulfilled. And I heard that from somebody, and I still cannot remember. And I need to remember. If you know who said that, let me know. But basically, we are the constant reminder. So the hatred, I think, of Black people, brown people, is because we are a constant reminder of the promise that has not been here. And so when I talk about families, I think a lot about sort of this work by Daniel Moynihan, who was actually the labor secretary under President Lyndon Johnson. And, one of his reports that still has deep roots in a lot of our family policies and our child policies is really the whole case about the Negro family, the case for national action, which we know as the Moynihan Report from 1965. Now, remember 1965 was, would that be when there was protests because of obviously Jim Crow, a lot of segregation issues, Black people were not getting opportunities. So we had a lot of different protests happening across the country from Detroit all the way to Chicago and so on and so forth, even in the West Coast. So in this report, and the reason I mentioned that is that he basically says that, Black families are just a tangle of pathologies, right? From disintegrating families, with poor educational outcomes, who don't have good jobs, who live in poor neighborhoods, who are just dysfunctional. And, and the Black family is really the reason because of the Black women, because they're pretty much chasing the Black men out the household. And so the Black men just become criminals and become imprisoned. So this was why there needs to be a national action, not to say, let's address the systemic issues that is causing any of the challenges of employment issues, education issues, disinvestment. Let's not talk about any of that. Let's talk about the Black family being a pathology. And the reason I do use this report as a sort of an underframe for family engagement is because the way that you see families actually indicates what you're going to do to help support them, elevate them, and see them in many ways. So when you have this report, at the same time, there was actually another one from another great scholar, Robert Hill, who used the same data, all the stuff, and said the strengths of Black families. This was a counter narrative that existed at the same time that said Black families have a strong kinship bond, right? I mean, it automatically, when you ask us about what are the things that we Tony, when you ask us, what are the things that brings a smile to our face? We talked about family because that is just our naturalness, right? That we, our love of family, our kinship is really important. We also have strong work orientation. How many people do you know were enslaved? And I think, Dr. Johnny Lake had put it in the chat box that, the cotton production increased over time, right? Not because you paid anybody, because they were enslaved, remember? So we have a strong work orientation. We have many women, many men who are working jobs where they're underpaid. Black women earn 78 cents to the dollar, right? So it's not like we're not working, it's that we are not paid a fair share. And of course, we have adaptable family roles. The reason is, if you think about the history, again, history is so important to us. If you know for a fact, because this is what was happening, we were literally taking families and separating them, right? You would either lynch a father here, you would rape a mother here, you would sell a child here. When you have created a history where the idea of nuclear family is tenable because you have power over that, that means that we have to create sort of a flexible family. We have to create flexible family roles because we don't know if our husband is going to be here because you'd either lynch them or imprison them or right. So that is the idea of it. But we also still have high achievement orientation. You tell me of a Black or brown family who's like, you know what, I hope my son or my daughter is a bum. You never heard that. You hear every single Black parent, every single Latino, every single family say, I want my child to get a high school education and get a college education. However, high school, college does not confer the same benefits for Black people. There are a lot of PhD Black people who are unemployed, not underemployed, unemployed. So this is not because they weren't brilliant. This is because of many things. So in the end of it, we still go get education, but it does not confer the same benefits. And of course, you've already heard the whole idea of religious orientation. So imagine if you heard these are the same group of people. You hear one that's about pathology, and you hear one about a narrative that's really about, here's all the things that they bring with them. Depending on how you see a family is how you're going to treat them. So if you see basically Black people or brown people or even poor people as a certain way, you're going to create policies that's like, okay, before I give you your $100 check, I'm going to make you piss in a cup. I'm going to make you fill out 100 sheets of paper. I'm going to make you come to the office on a bus that takes 3 hours to come, basically prove that you're working, right? So we create all of these challenges just to give me $100 because the $100 is going to actually make me a millionaire. That is what we create. But now if you think of a different narrative that says, oh my goodness, this group of families are really all about education. They really are strong. They have a strong work orientation. They believe in working hard. That creates a totally different kind of policy. That creates a different kind of systems that says, because we know how much you cherish it, we're going to say, you know what? here's $100. Nope, we don't need we don't need anything, because our data shows already when families are given money untethered, they actually are likely to start a business, go to school, do everything else, because they don't have to address all of these paperwork and accountability, right? This is the distinction of, depending on how you see families, is going to be how you actually engage with them. And our policies are the same way. If I see families as less than not trustworthy, then I'm going to create policies that's going to create a whole lot of issues so that they never get what is actually deserved of them. Right. So I'm not going to talk too much, because I know we're running out of time a little bit, but I will say this, right? What negative narratives have you heard about your families, even probably about yourself, right? And how do you go about challenging that, right? How do you use the policies and practices to challenge those narratives? Because once those narratives are set, they're actually hard to change. And that is just the reality of it all, right? So we have seen that programs built for poor people tend to have, like, remember I said earlier, Head Start has how many standards? When you're paying a workforce literally $12 an hour in Oregon, I'm not sure how far that goes. I know North Carolina, it doesn't go that far either, and we're in the South, right? So think about it. If you believe that a workforce or a family that to prove that they deserve this special service, to have standards of that magnitude indicates that you don't trust that the workforce, the programs, the families are going to meet the barrier. Because how much do you trust their ability? So this is what we have to begin to ask ourselves. And so that's the issue of critique. Ask the question, why? So what negative narratives have you heard about your families? Talk about it in the chat box, because I think that's going to help us begin to say, how do we change that narrative? Like we said earlier, how do we unlearn to relearn? How do we challenge those narratives and continue to see children, continue to see families more than what we tell each other, what we see at face value? Right? What areas of parenting are challenging for you in particular, right? And is it challenging, or that you don't have the resources, the supports, whatever they may be? What areas are challenging? Because in the end of it, to me, while I think classrooms are critically important and educators in the classroom are important, to me, families literally are the ones that children see, right? Barring any sort of unexpected circumstances, that is, families are with children for the rest of their life. So for those who work with, partner with, collaborate families, you are one of the most critical drivers. But of course, our policies are like, well, those who are family support specialists, or if you call them family advocates or whatever you call them, their case was about, 60-1. Now imagine tell a teacher, I'm gonna give you 60 kids, and I want you to help these 60 kids be the best that they can be. Well, so it tells us a lot of things, that there's certain, even within our own early childhood sector, there's certain things that we privilege. It tells us that, we want to just go directly and quote unquote fix children. We don't actually want to work with families. So actually, I collaborate with this national early childhood network. And I was like, so we wanted to revise the survey because we wanted to capture issues of racial discrimination and all those kind of things, and even how families are experiencing poverty. Mind you that this is a network that the underlying funder is a public institution called Head Start. And the professionals, both the educators, the school leaders, and the family engagement specialists, like, well, I feel uncomfortable talking about poverty with my family. I don't want to talk about that. And I don't want to talk about issues of racism. And I think for me, that I think shook me more than it should have. I was not prepared for educational professionals who work with families who qualify for Head Start, who are in Head Start programs, to say, I don't want to talk to families about poverty or the economic standards, but they're in the program because of their economic standing. And I don't want to talk about racism or discrimination, but you're in program that literally where the families are Black, the families are Latino, that like they are racially segregated because of where they live. And so it really, I think what it shook me, because it was like, then what are you talking to them about? How do you actually support families to do both economic stability and economic mobility? Or is our job to keep families where they are? Because if you're not talking about issues of racism, if you're not talking about issues of poverty, what are you talking about? Oh, read to your children. Right. When I have 3 jobs, I got to go get on a bus. I can't pay my bills. I can barely find food to eat. But I should read to my kid because that's going to fill their belly. Like, so to me, it's like, what are you actually talking about? How are you helping families, generate wealth? How are you helping families get out of the stressors of daily life that comes with economic insecurity? So that shook me. And it sort of reminded me that we are a vulnerable, sensitive group, that we want to quote unquote help people, but we don't want to help people out of poverty. We don't want to help people literally to stop dealing with racism. So for me, I'm still shaken from that knowledge that is like, what are you talking to families about? So that's my question to you all. What are you talking to your families about, right? Like, yes, there's many things to talk about, but if your job, if part of the role of a family engagement specialist or even a program is to help families find economic stability, afford mobility, address any stress or trauma, what are the things, what would you talk about, right? How would you go about that? So I'm going to give you with these 4 practical tools that I hope will be helpful as you sort of, for those who may be uncomfortable asking their family, how much do you make? You know that they qualify for subsidy or something, which is why they're a Head Start. Of course, there are some families who don't because they may have a child with special needs. However, the majority qualify, right? So what are some things you can do? So here are 4 E's, as we call them, of culturally responsive anti-bias framework for family engagement. And so hopefully this will help you, just practical skills. So the 4 E's. So the first one is really about exploration, right? You just have to understand families' experiences. What are their resources? What are their assets? I think as Tanya has articulated, we can't just ask about what are all the problems without saying, what are the cultural assets you bring? What is your language? How did you make it through the pandemic? Who did you rely on? What are the kinship supports you have, et cetera? And also ask about their fears and their history. You know, when somebody asks you, how are you doing? You don't say, I'm okay. I say, I don't know how I'm feeling today because X, Y, and Z. Like, right, we want to be able to actually engage in how are you doing? And you can't do that if you're not asking families, what do you feel like today? What can I do the best to help support you and help you thrive? Right? You don't know if you don't ask those questions. So exploration is critically important to do that, right? Because that will help us identify what positive programs are perpetuating inequities or privileges. Whose voices are you not hearing when you ask about how you doing? What are the exploration things? And then the second E is all about expectations, right? One of the biggest drivers of children's achievement is expectations. It's not about how many books you got, how much you're reading, how many athletic and art courses. Those are great. But it's really about the expectations that parents and or teachers have for children. And you know why that is? Because when you have the highest of expectations, when you believe in the excellence, as Tanya said, of all children, you lay the groundwork, you create the condition for that to be, right? Kids actually usually reach what you put for them. And so when you have high expectations for families, then you're likely going to set the condition for that to happen, right? So this is really that important point that we have to remember. So the other is about expectation. Again, I'm not saying for you to go expect your parents to come in at 2 p.m. when they have to work a third shift. But I am saying that if we believe that every family believes and wants their children to thrive and be excellent, we set the condition, say, what can I do to help you create that condition in your family, in the program that we have, whatever services we're providing? Right? So asking what the expectations are that's neurocentric is critically important. Find out what are the obstacles to thrive in that is important. Again, it's not about self-pity. It's not about pity, period. It's really about how do we make sure that we have expectations and we create the conditions for families to make that expectation. And then education. And I'm not talking about go get a PhD, go get a BA. I'm not talking about that part. But either way, those are all important. But what I am talking about is that we have to elevate families' knowledge about policies and systems. The issue is that even when we have things like IDEA and Part C that says families must have access to special education, they must have access to early intervention, even if we have that written in law, if you don't know your rights to all the services, to the supports, then that's a problem. For some families, particularly families who may not speak English, whose home may not be, the US, who may not understand all the nuances. That means that our job should be to share information, not to tell people what to do, but to share information. And the more we educate families about the systems, the more that they themselves could do the actual, I would say the last one, which is, I used to call it empowerment. I don't use that anymore because it's really a pejorative term, but it's really, once people are educated about the system, then they have the equipment to actually advocate for change, right? This is that part where when families know that, oh, shoot, this is what I got to go through. This is literally the system that gets my kid from the school. This is what the school to prison pipeline looks like. This is what I got to do. When families know that, they now are equipped to both do things for their children, but also to be activated for other people's children and to be activated for the workforce, right? I would say, you know, people talk about the American Rescue Plan that was just passed, right? Like it just happened like, oh, somebody said, oh, you should do this, President Biden. No, people were working on that for over a decade, right? This is during Obama's time. Right. So this means that advocacy is important and it could take a long time, but by continuing to fight, you can get your reward eventually. And so part of equipment is to give families the information, having a high expectation, creating a condition, and just finding out what are your fears? What are your values? What could I do to contribute to your best self and your families? Right. And that means that once I give you that, you now have the equipment to be a change agent, both in my program. So they may actually start questioning you. Why are you doing X, Y, and Z? Why is this happening? Why do you have the standards? I don't think this is appropriate. This is really not helping my children or the language they speak. So they can begin to question even your programming, your policies. But that's important for change to happen, is to have those who are actually going to be impacted the most to be part of the change that we hope to see. So I would say in the end of it, this is my 4 E's to you to say, if you're trying to really engage in anti-bias, a culture responsive pedagogy of any sort, whether in the classroom in particular, but also with families in particular, that we have to actually hear their voices. Like people say, oh, center families' voices, center them. But if you're not hearing them and then you're not receiving it, then you might as well just do whatever the hell you're doing, right? So this is why in the end of it, I'm pushing each and every one of you to think about the principles that Tanya has laid down about how do you engage in anti-bias, anti-racist classrooms that are culturally relevant. Again, it's not just about Black and brown children. White children who are steeped in privilege, white children who are steeped in fragility is not going to set our country up for better. The idea that we can protect white children while Black and brown children have to do the talk, prepare our children. Like I have to talk to my son about things that he's 48 months old. And to say that white children should not be exposed to the reality of racism, the reality of systemic inequities, is actually not doing them service. So I would say that what we need to do is figure out, yes, I think as was said earlier, that we have to meet families where they are, but we cannot shelter families or children from the reality. This is not about trying to just do Black and brown children and fix them. This is about we have to continue to push even white families and white children that our country needs them to be their best selves, or our country will be destroyed, because there is no nation that has lived where you have such internal and civic conflict. Can we name all the nations that are still here after having conflict? Let's go to the continent of Africa. Let's go to the countries in Latin America. There is no country that's going to survive if we do not shed this issue. So the fact that even I'm in a state that's also trying to fight, culture, critical race theory. Remind you, CRT is an academic thing. It's not for Twitter. This is not a Twitter conversation. This is an academic thing that people like us just do to feel smarter. This is us. And to use as a political tool tells us that we are creating a country where we want to sort of create fragility, and that's not going to make us strong to deal with the real enemies that are out there. So I would say that no matter who you are and where you are, that we have to continue to fight, and we have to give the tools to our families, no matter whether they're Black families, Latino families, Native tribal families, and even white families. We have to shed this idea of fragility and sensitivity, because without that, we are not going to be a true nation. So I say thank you. I'm going to stop talking and give the mic back to Erin, Ashley, and of course, Tony.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Aruka and Dr. Durden. Thank you for sharing culturally responsive principles with us, the 4 E's with us, and thank you for reminding us that moment-to-moment interactions, how we respond to systemic policies and inequities, and how our values and our beliefs around families are so impactful on our programs and our work. So I'm really sitting with, how will we challenge our narratives or our program narratives to change circumstances? What are we doing to set up students and families for success? Wow, just thank you so much. So I just want to take a moment for us to all have a virtual round of applause for Dr. Durden and for Dr. Aruka. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much. So we're going to take some time to process that part 2. And we're going to jump back into some random breakout groups of 3 people. This time, The breakout discussion will be an opportunity for introductions. Once again, meet a new round of people. And then each person will have an opportunity to share what's something that you heard that stuck out to you. What's something that you would add? What's something that you're curious about? And what's something that you're leaving here aspiring to after hearing all of these powerful pieces? So once again, please try to identify somebody as the recorder to capture your discussion in the same document as earlier, or capture your notes on your own for your planning discussions later if you'll be here for the second part of the afternoon. To close, I would love to see how folks are just kind of leaving this space today. Go ahead and put in the chat, you know, a word or 2 words or something that describes how you're feeling about these conversations today or about the work moving forward. I know it's been a long virtual day and we are all a little bit tired, but I'm so uplifted and honestly so inspired by all of the dreaming and the momentum I've heard here today. I'm energized, as someone else just said, just by hearing all of your ideas and all of your excitement over the content today and about how it'll inform your programs and practices. I'm really excited to see how that manifests. So I am going to link an exit ticket in the chat here in a moment. I'm going to let some more of these feelings kind of trickle in so that the link doesn't get lost. But I'll send out that exit ticket link here. And if you could please take a moment or 2 to just fill this out, it really does support our internal learning and growth and planning for future events like this and for our future work together with each of the school teams here. So on that, we are closing, and I just want to give a huge thank you to all of you for spending the day with us, learning and planning. Thank you for the work that you do each day to educate Oregon's children and to support your peers. This day would not have been possible without an amazing team effort from Yanni Castillo-Flores, Ashley Walker, Ellie O'Brate, Melissa Duclos, Aaron Helgren, Brian Berry, Amy True, Subin O, Laura Labar, Marina Merrill, and Karen Twain, and Aaron Lolich. And a special thank you to our valued partners, Kendra Hughes and Ali Stutzer. Thank you so much for supporting us today from the Northwest Regional Educational Service District. Thank you for being here. Bye, everybody.